Hey guys, welcome back to the Sleep Atlas. Tonight, we're traveling back to one of history's strangest paradoxes, an army of monks, men who swore vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, then marched into battle with swords gleaming in the sunlight and banners blazing red crosses against white, the Knights Templar. For the next 2 hours, you're not in the 21st century anymore. You're in the age of cathedrals and crusades, relics and rumors, faith and fear. And as always, if you enjoy these journeys through history that help you fall asleep, please subscribe for more nights like this one. It helps the channel, and it helps you find your way back when you need another story to drift away to. Now tell me in the comments, what's keeping you up tonight? Because tonight, we're going to talk about a brotherhood that was born in faith, drenched in blood, and consumed by legend. A story that begins not in a palace, but in silence. Imagine, a torch flickers in an underground chamber beneath Jerusalem. The year is 1119. The city still smells faintly of conquest, burned wood, incense, and the metallic tang of drying blood. 9 knights kneel in a circle. Their armor creaks as they bow their heads. One of them, Hugh de Payens, a French nobleman with eyes like chipped flint, swears an oath before God to live without wealth, without women, without fear, to protect the pilgrims traveling these deadly roads to the Holy Sepulchre. No music, no witnesses, just men and stone and the echo of words they can never unsay. That's how the Knights Templar began, or at least how history thinks they did. But as with most things that begin in the dark, the truth is more complicated. Chapter 1. The Secret Birth of a Holy Army. Jerusalem in 1119 was not a place of peace. The First Crusade had ended 20 years earlier, and what the Crusaders left behind wasn't holiness, it was chaos. The Holy City was technically Christian, ruled by a Latin king, but the streets were still littered with ghosts. Mosques had been turned into churches. Pilgrims from Europe wandered through the desert, barefoot and dazed, believing they were walking through the Bible itself. And everywhere, the tension between faiths hung thick as incense. The roads between the coast and the city were a nightmare. Bandits, raiders, and desert tribes preyed on travelers like wolves. Every year, hundreds of unarmed pilgrims set out from the ports of Jaffa or Acre to see the place where Christ had died, and many never arrived. It was a land where faith could get you killed faster than sin. Enter those 9 knights, poor, devout, and possibly bored noblemen from northern France. Their leader, Hugh de Payens, had fought in the Crusades and stayed behind when most went home. He and 8 companions approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a strange request. They wanted permission to form a new order of knights, not to conquer, not to rule, but to guard. The king said yes. The church hesitated. Nobody quite knew what to do with these men. They were knights, yes, but they claimed to be monks too. The idea didn't fit into any box the medieval world understood. A soldier was supposed to fight, a monk was supposed to pray, and these men wanted to do both. Baldwin gave them quarters in a building that stood on the ruins of the Temple of Solomon, the most sacred and controversial ground in the world. And that's where their name came from. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or more simply, the Knights Templar. Now here's where things start to shimmer with myth, because for nearly a decade, nobody heard much from them. No glorious battles, no public presence, just 9 knights living quietly in a half-ruined temple, claiming to protect pilgrims. And that's when the whispers began. What were they doing under the temple? Some said they were excavating. Others said they were searching for something buried deep beneath the stones, relics perhaps, or knowledge long hidden since the days of Solomon himself. Modern archaeologists will tell you this is nonsense, of course, but even they admit the Templars had access to the Temple Mount, a privilege almost no one else in Christendom enjoyed, and for years they dug there with the Church's blessing. When they finally emerged into public life, they were different, organized, wealthy, confident, almost as if they'd found something that changed everything. But let's step back for a moment. The early 11th century was an age of improvisation. The Crusader states were young, messy, and barely hanging on. Every kingdom was a patchwork of loyalties, half knights, half pilgrims, and a lot of wishful thinking. The Church was desperate for order, and the Templars offered exactly that, a blend of zeal and discipline that looked like divine intervention in armor. It was a brilliant pitch, and they sold it well. When Hugh de Payens traveled back to Europe in 1127 to seek official recognition, he met with kings, nobles, and eventually the Pope himself. The Church loved them, a holy army that required no payment, asked for no land, and swore absolute loyalty to God. It was a bureaucrat's dream. Pope Honorius II granted them official status, and a few years later, in 1139, another pope, Innocent II, took it even further. He declared that the Templars answered to no king, no bishop, and no law except the popes. They were untouchable, exempt from taxes, allowed to cross borders freely, and permitted to collect donations directly from the faithful. In other words, the Knights Templar became a multinational corporation, centuries before such a thing should have existed. And that's where their story stops being quaint and starts getting strange. Because remember, these were men who began with nothing. Their symbol was two knights riding a single horse, a visual metaphor for poverty. Within a generation, that same order owned castles, fleets, and entire banking networks. They were the world's first financial institution that operated across borders. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, there's still just 9 men under the ruins of Solomon's temple, holding candles against the dark. Picture it. The smell of wax and oil smoke, the faint hum of wind through broken columns, the distant cries of muezzins echoing from the city below. The world is shifting. Faith, power, greed, all swirling together into something entirely new. Somewhere between prayer and politics, the Templars had found a formula that worked. A soldier's discipline, a monk's devotion, and a businessman's pragmatism, all wrapped in one dazzling symbol, a red cross on white. And as their power grew, so did the myth. People whispered that the knights never truly slept, that their prayers could call down miracles, that their swords glowed in battle like divine fire. In an age starved for heroes, the Templars became living icons. And for the Church, they were proof that holiness could conquer the world, or at least fund its expansion. Still, even in these early days, the seeds of their downfall were already being planted, because whenever power hides behind purity, suspicion follows. For now, though the world was enchanted by them, Europe sent them gold, recruits, and blessings. The Templars began to build fortresses across the Holy Land, stark geometric structures designed not for beauty but for survival. The first of these rose near Gaza, its walls thick and severe as if carved from a single thought, hold, and hold they did. Against heat, disease, and endless waves of enemies, the Templars endured. They were a strange hybrid, too pious for ordinary knights, too violent for ordinary monks, but somehow they worked. The desert turned them into something sharper, harder, less human, and the world rewarded them for it. By the end of the 12th century, the Templars were no longer a curiosity. They were a force of nature. Their red cross fluttered on every major battlefield from Antioch to Acre. Pilgrims prayed to them as if they were saints. Kings borrowed money from them as if they were banks, and behind their stoic silence they smiled, because they knew the holiest men in Christendom were also its most indispensable. The Holy Land. It sounds peaceful, doesn't it? Golden deserts, olive groves, sun-bleached ruins, the kind of place you might imagine angels hovering over in serene silence. But in the early 12th century, it was anything but serene. Jerusalem had been liberated by Christian crusaders only a few decades earlier, and let's be clear, liberation in medieval terms usually meant blood up to the ankles. The First Crusade had ended with the massacre of nearly every inhabitant of the city, Muslim, Jew, and even some Christians unlucky enough to be standing in the wrong doorway. The survivors who staggered out of those gates left behind a city that was holy, yes, but also haunted. Now, imagine you're one of the pilgrims arriving from Europe after that carnage. You've sold your land, kissed your family goodbye, and endured months on a leaky ship that smelled of salt, vomit, and desperation. You finally set foot on the sacred soil of Jerusalem, only to realize it's crawling with mercenaries, thieves, and rival priests arguing over who owns which holy relic. There were monks selling pieces of the true cross for pocket change, relic peddlers waving around bones that supposedly belonged to every apostle, and beggars who could quote scripture better than bishops. It was chaotic, commercial, and weirdly alive. The Holy Land was supposed to be a place of purity, but it was also a marketplace of faith, and this was the world the Templars were born into. To protect pilgrims, they needed roads. To patrol the roads, they needed horses. To feed the horses, they needed money. And to get money, they needed support from Europe, which meant they needed branding. And few groups in history have ever branded themselves better. The Knights of the Temple. It sounded like a riddle, a name that whispered of prophecy, secrecy, destiny. In an age addicted to relics and miracles, the idea of an army living on sacred ground was irresistible. Still, their mission was grimly practical. The routes from the ports to Jerusalem, Jaffa, Acre, Tyre, were treacherous. Travelers were robbed, murdered, or sold into slavery. The Templars became the bodyguards of faith itself, escorting caravans of believers through the desert, fighting off raiders who saw pilgrims as walking coin purses. Picture it, a long line of weary travelers trudging beneath a white-hot sun, sandals kicking up dust, and ahead of them a small band of armored men on horseback, faces hidden behind helms, silent except for the creak of leather and the dull thud of hooves. To see that Red Cross approaching must have felt like salvation made visible. But Jerusalem wasn't the only concern. Beyond the city walls, the Crusader states were fracturing. Christian lords squabbled like children over territory they barely controlled. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, all were fragile, stitched together by ambition and distrust. The Muslim world, meanwhile, was far from united but infinitely more patient. Leaders like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and later Saladin understood that the Crusaders were temporary. Empires built on zeal tend to burn bright and burn out. The Templars didn't know it yet, but they were living on borrowed time. For now, though, their world was still expanding. They built their first fortresses across the Holy Land, massive, angular structures that looked more like stone mathematics than architecture. No decoration, no vanity, just geometry and faith. These weren't castles meant to impress. They were meant to survive. Thick walls, narrow gates, cisterns for water, hidden staircases for escape. If you were a Templar stationed in one, your days were predictable. Prayer, patrol, repair, repeat. The heat was relentless. Armor became ovens. Horses collapsed from thirst. And yet, they endured. They believed every drop of sweat was a prayer, every scar a kind of devotion. The Templar life was monastic but also militarized. They rose before dawn, prayed, trained, rode, and ate simple meals in silence. Even at the table they sat in pairs, sharing food from a single bowl, just as they once shared horses when they were poor. That duality, poverty and power, humility and dominance, defined them. To outsiders it made the Templars look almost supernatural. They were disciplined in a world that thrived on chaos. They didn't drink, gamble, or chase women. They didn't hoard gold for themselves, but for the order. Compared to the average Crusader knight, who often behaved like a drunk tourist with a sword, the Templars seemed godlike. But discipline has its price. Their strictness made them feared, but it also made them cold. And in a land that worshipped stories, coldness was suspicious. Rumors spread that they worshipped strange idols, that their prayers were not quite Christian, that beneath their white mantles they bore symbols not approved by Rome. None of it was true, yet, but you can see why people started to talk. The Templars were always apart. They answered to no king, no priest, and no local authority. They were an army within an army, a church within the church. And whenever men form a power that stands outside all others, paranoia soon follows. Still, in the 1130s and 1140s, those fears were whispers drowned out by praise. Pilgrims wrote home about the silent, white-cloaked knights who saved them from bandits. Kings sent donations, nobles offered land. The Templar name spread across Europe like wildfire. Soon new recruits poured in, sons of minor lords, second brothers with no inheritance, men too proud to farm and too poor to rule. To join the Templars was to gain purpose, rank, and immortality of a kind. When they swore their vows, they gave up everything, property, family, even their names. They became one organism, and that made them terrifyingly efficient. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, politics festered. The so-called Latin kingdom looked glamorous from afar. Gleaming churches, processions of relics, knights shimmering in gold. But behind the spectacle lay disease, infighting, and endless debt. Maintaining an army in the desert cost a fortune, and Europe's appetite for holy war was already fading. That's where the Templars' financial genius quietly began. They developed systems for storing, transferring, and protecting wealth for pilgrims and crusaders alike. A traveler could deposit money at a Templar preceptory in London, receive a coded letter, and withdraw the funds safely in Jerusalem. It was medieval banking, and it worked. While the kings of the Crusader states struggled to feed their armies, the Templars were busy inventing international finance. It's a miracle they didn't invent the credit card. Their wealth, however, wasn't just monetary, it was reputational. In a world obsessed with honor, the Templar cross became a brand of trust. Churches displayed it proudly, merchants painted it on their ships. Even thieves hesitated to rob a Templar convoy because rumor said anyone who did would die within the year. But faith and fear are fickle allies. By mid-century, the political tides began to turn. Muslim forces under unified banners were pushing back. The dream of permanent Christian rule in the East was already fraying. The Templars found themselves fighting not for glory but for survival. Still, for every setback, they doubled down. When they lost a castle, they built two more. When armies fell, they recruited faster. When allies faltered, they became their own nation of stone and secrecy. You can almost admire the sheer stubbornness of it. The idea that faith could replace geography, that brotherhood could outlast empire. By the late 12th century, The Templars were no longer 9 poor knights in a ruin. They were the backbone of Christendom's military and financial power. Their headquarters in Jerusalem gleamed with marble. Their fortresses dotted the coasts of Syria and Palestine. Their banner, a red cross on white, was feared from Cairo to Constantinople, and yet the cracks were already showing. The Holy Land had always been an illusion of permanence. Empires rose there only to crumble beneath the same sun. The Templars, for all their discipline, could not change geography. They were foreigners defending a dream, and dreams, like empires, are fragile things. For now, though, as the night deepens and the desert cools, imagine the campfires of the Templar outposts glowing under a canopy of stars. The wind sighs across the sand. The horses snort softly in their sleep. A monk knight kneels beside a stone wall, whispering a prayer in Latin that drifts into the dark like smoke. Somewhere far to the west, Europe sleeps, safe, wealthy, and unaware that its most sacred soldiers are already walking the thin edge between salvation and damnation. Imagine the year is 1120. The air in Jerusalem still hums with dust and incense, the streets winding like veins between crumbling walls and half-rebuilt churches. The Crusaders hold the city now, but barely. Pilgrims shuffle past soldiers, merchants haggle beside priests. Somewhere, a choir is singing in Latin while a camel coughs nearby. It's the kind of world where the sacred and the absurd coexist perfectly comfortably, and beneath all that noise something else is stirring. 9 men, that's all. 9 poor French knights, led by a man named Hugues de Payon. They arrive in Jerusalem without fanfare. No army, no banner, no gold. They make a simple request to King Baldwin II, the use of a few rooms on the Temple Mount. The king agrees, perhaps amused by their humility. He gives them quarters in the old Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders believed sat atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple. That's where the story becomes hazy. Officially, these knights called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Their stated mission: to protect pilgrims traveling to and from the Holy Land. A noble enough cause and one desperately needed. But here's the question. Historians still whisper over their coffee. If their job was guarding roads, why did they spend the next 9 years living almost entirely underground? According to later accounts, the Templars rarely left the Temple Mount during that first decade. They dug tunnels, moved stones, and kept their activities secret. When questioned, they gave vague answers about renovations and holy works, which, let's be honest, is exactly what you say when you don't want people to ask more questions. So what were they doing? The truth is, no one knows for certain. But speculation has filled that silence for centuries. Some believe they were excavating ancient ruins, searching for relics buried since the days of Solomon. Others suggest they were hunting for texts, scrolls containing forgotten wisdom, early Gnostic writings, alchemical treatises, even architectural blueprints said to hold divine secrets. And then, of course, there's the most enduring rumor of all, the Holy Grail. It's easy to roll your eyes now, but picture it from their perspective. You're in the 12th century, sleeping on the ruins of the most mythic temple in history. You're a warrior who believes God speaks through symbols, and beneath your feet are thousands of years of rubble, Babylonian, Persian, Roman, Byzantine. If faith ever had a basement full of mysteries, this was it. The Templars' time under the Temple Mount became the seed of every legend that followed. Later chroniclers claimed they discovered something extraordinary, but were maddeningly vague about what that was. Some said they found the Ark of the Covenant, Others insisted they unearthed gold from Solomon's treasury. More imaginative souls suggested they uncovered proof of bloodlines, records linking Christ's family to European royalty. And then, of course, there were the occult theorists who decided the knights had learned sacred geometry, secret knowledge about the structure of the universe itself. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. When the Templars finally emerged, they were not the same men who went in. They returned to Europe transformed, quietly powerful, almost unnervingly composed. Hugues de Payen travelled to France and sought an audience with Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the age. Bernard was a Cistercian monk, a man so ascetic he considered sleep an indulgence and food a distraction. Yet he was also a brilliant strategist, the closest thing the medieval church had to a public relations genius. Hugues explained the mission, a brotherhood of knights bound by poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicated to God but armed for war. Bernard immediately saw the potential. It was a paradox so perfect it had to be divine. Monks who killed, soldiers who prayed, holy poverty funded by the wealth of nations. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the Templars received official papal approval. They were no longer just a handful of wanderers. They were an order of the Church. Bernard even wrote a sermon for them in praise of the new knighthood, describing the Templar as a man who fears neither demons nor men, because he bears Christ in his heart and steel in his hand. It was marketing genius. Overnight, the Templars went from mysterious diggers under a ruin to God's chosen army. Donations poured in, nobles offered land, peasants offered sons. The Templar banner, white for purity, red for martyrdom, became one of the most recognized symbols in Christendom. But still, the whispers persisted. Even as they rose, people kept asking, what did they find beneath that temple? Why did they never speak of those 9 silent years? The truth, if there is one, is probably less cinematic and more bureaucratic. Archaeology as we know it didn't exist. Digging beneath ancient ruins wasn't about science. It was about faith and superstition. Maybe they really did find something sacred. Maybe they found nothing but stones. But it almost didn't matter. The mystery itself was more powerful than any treasure, and the Templars knew how to use that. You see, medieval Europe adored relics because relics made the invisible visible. A saint's bone could turn a dusty chapel into a pilgrimage site. A scrap of cloth from Christ's robe could transform a forgotten village into a holy destination. The Templars, deliberately or not, became a living relic. They didn't need to show proof of miracles. Their very existence was the miracle. Their silence became their sanctity, their secrecy, their strength. And silence travels farther than any sermon. When you think of the early Templars, don't picture roaring armies. Picture candlelight flickering in a stone corridor, the faint echo of Latin prayers, the sound of picks striking stone somewhere deep beneath the earth. 9 men convinced that God had chosen them for something they didn't fully understand, but could feel like a heartbeat in the dark. The idea of the hidden runs through everything they did afterward. Their architecture, simple, geometric, full of hidden passages. Their symbols, crosses, circles, dual riders on one horse. Even their banking system, which relied on coded letters and secret ledgers, carried that same shadowy precision. It's as if the memory of that underground decade never left them. They had been under the world, and when they emerged, they brought a little of the underworld with them. By the time they were formally recognized, the order already had chapters spreading across Europe. Preceptories in Paris, London, and Aragon became both fortresses and treasuries. Templar seals began to appear on documents everywhere. a sign that whatever business was being done, it was trustworthy, incorruptible, and conveniently untouchable by taxes. They were monks, they were soldiers, they were accountants, and they were untouchable. If it sounds like a setup for disaster, that's because it was. But for now, their ascent felt unstoppable. Jerusalem glowed in their imagination as both a holy city and a buried promise. Whatever they had found, or thought they had found, gave them a sense of destiny that radiated outward. They built fortresses across the Holy Land like a constellation, each one a star of faith, light against the desert. They moved with precision, their ranks swelling from 9 to hundreds. Their banners fluttered beside kings, yet their loyalty remained solely to the order and to God, or at least their version of him. And through it all, that mystery under the temple lingered, quiet and magnetic. Even centuries later, when the Templars were long gone, legends kept sprouting like weeds. Freemasons claimed descent from their architects. Alchemists said their secrets survived in hidden manuscripts. Occultists saw them as guardians of forbidden wisdom. Historians, somewhat exasperated, kept insisting they were just monks with good bookkeeping skills. But deep down, everyone wanted to believe there was something more, that somewhere beneath the dust of Jerusalem, a secret still slept. So perhaps it's fitting that the story of the Knights Templar begins not with battle, but with silence, not with conquest, but with curiosity. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the most powerful empires are often built on unanswered questions. The Templars' first great victory wasn't on a battlefield, it was in the imagination, and that, more than gold or relics or papal favor, would carry them into legend. Picture Rome in the early 12th century, a city that smells of candle wax and incense, but also of politics. Papal banners hang limp in the sun. Monks shuffle through marble corridors whispering in Latin, and outside the streets reek of tanneries and ambition. The church by now was more than a faith. It was the nervous system of Europe, pulsing through every kingdom, dictating who ruled, who knelt, and who burned. Kings were crowned by its hands, empires justified by its blessings. And into this complicated organism walked Hugh de Payen and his strange little band of knights. They didn't look like much. They were poor, quiet, foreign. Their armor was worn, their mission vague. Yet they brought with them something the church found irresistible: usefulness. You see, the Holy Land was chaos. The Crusader kingdoms had been carved from blood and miracle, and now they were crumbling just as quickly. Pilgrims were still being robbed, caravans ambushed, relics stolen, and cities changed hands faster than anyone could update the maps. The church needed protectors, reliable ones, faithful ones, and the Templars, well, they were perfect. No wives, no children, no debts, no distractions, just pure obedience. The kind of men who'd ride into battle without pay, die without complaint, and most importantly, funnel everything they owned directly into the hands of the church. But they needed legitimacy first. The Pope's blessing wasn't just a stamp of approval, it was armor. It turned obscure men into an institution. So Hugh de Payen traveled to meet with the powerful Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, a man both saintly and strategic. Bernard was the face of the Cistercian reform movement, which prized simplicity, purity, and obedience. He lived on bread, wore plain robes, and wrote letters that could humble kings. He was also, conveniently, the Pope's favorite monk. When Hughes explained the idea of warrior monks, men who prayed like monks but fought like crusaders, Bernard saw opportunity gleaming like gold leaf in a gospel. Think of it. Europe was overflowing with restless knights, violent men with nothing to do once the Crusades ended. They roamed the countryside, looting villages, feuding over puddles of land, and repenting on Sundays. The church couldn't stop them, but what if it could redirect them? The Templars were the perfect solution. Channel the chaos of knighthood into a holy purpose, sanctify violence, wrap war in prayer. Bernard became their champion. He wrote, in praise of the new knighthood, a sermon that would become their manifesto. In it, he drew a sharp line between ordinary knights and these new holy warriors. The Knight of Christ, he wrote, fights the battles of the Lord without fear, for he bears Christ in his heart and steel in his hand. It was genius, simple, poetic, dangerous. With those words, the Templars became the Church's favorite paradox. Men who could kill for peace, who could die for salvation, who could hold a sword and a rosary in the same hand and never feel the contradiction. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, the Templars were officially recognized as a religious order. Pope Honorius II approved their rule, a strict code of conduct modeled after monastic life but adapted for war. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They ate in silence. They wore plain white mantles to symbolize purity, later marked by a red cross, the color of martyrdom. They slept in communal dormitories, their armor near at hand. They prayed 8 times a day. And yet they were also soldiers, men who trained for battle, guarded caravans, and fought with terrifying precision. It was an impossible combination, but that was the point. The contradiction itself was their mystique. The Church, always hungry for spectacle, adored it. Sermons across Europe began praising these poor knights of Christ as living saints. Relics were touched to their swords. Songs were written about their devotion. Donors poured gold into their coffers. Within a decade, they owned lands across France, England, and Iberia. Within 2, they controlled a network that stretched from London to Jerusalem, all under the cross, all under God. The irony, of course, was that their vow of poverty made them one of the richest organizations in Europe. Nobles who couldn't join gave donations instead. Merchants stored money in Templar houses for safekeeping, the world's first reliable banking network. Pilgrims could deposit coins in Paris and withdraw them in Acre. It was faith-based finance, centuries before anyone invented the word finance, and all of it tax-free. The papal bulls that followed granted them extraordinary privileges. Templars answered only to the Pope himself. They could cross borders freely, build their own churches, even collect tithes. Kings couldn't touch them. Bishops couldn't question them. They were a country within a country, a kingdom without a king. And perhaps most importantly, they believed their mission was divine. Every Templar fortress was built like a sermon in stone, simple, geometric, symmetrical. Their architecture rejected ornamentation, favoring clean lines and silent strength. Every chapel pointed east toward Jerusalem. Every wall was both defense and devotion. They didn't just build structures, they consecrated the landscape. Travelers who saw them described the order as unnervingly calm. They marched without shouting. They fought without looting. They prayed without hesitation. To their enemies they were terrifying. To their allies, indispensable. And to themselves, they were chosen. You can almost hear it in the rhythm of their days, the steady tolling of bells, the scraping of armor on stone floors, the murmured prayers before dawn, each man believing he was part of something eternal. But let's be clear, beneath the holiness there was also bureaucracy. For every knight who swung a sword, A dozen servants and scribes managed logistics, accounts, and correspondence. Templar commanderies became administrative hubs full of ledgers, seals, and shipments. They dealt in contracts as often as crusades. Still, their image remained pure. To medieval Europe, the Knights Templar were walking proof that heaven and earth could coexist, that spiritual discipline could be forged into literal steel. But to the cynical eye, they were something even more interesting, the Church's experiment in privatized holiness. They were what happens when faith becomes an organization, efficient, obedient, and profitable. By the mid-12th century, the Templars had become indispensable. Crusader kings relied on them for defense. Merchants trusted them with their fortunes. Popes used them as envoys and bankers. If you wanted something done quickly, quietly, and absolutely, you called the Templars. But with power came something more dangerous than sin, perception. People began to notice that the Order's members rarely answered questions. They had their own language, their own symbols, their own rites. Their headquarters, a vast round church in London modelled after the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, seemed deliberately mysterious. And then there were the rumours, always the rumours. Some said they still possessed what they found under Solomon's temple. Others claimed they performed secret ceremonies, that they whispered oaths in the dark, that they had seen things no mortal should. And yet, the Church did not question them, not yet. For now, Rome was content. The Templars had become everything it could hope for, holy warriors, loyal bankers, global agents of faith. But you can sense the shift coming, can't you? The same way you feel a storm before it breaks. Because no institution, no matter how divine, can grow this fast, this powerful, without making enemies. Kings who owed them money began to resent them. Clergy jealous of their wealth began to whisper, and the pilgrims they once protected began to wonder if these poor knights might be serving something other than God. But that part of the story comes later. For now the Order stands at its shining zenith, a creation of faith and fear, cloaked in purity but humming with power. The Vatican's blessing had turned them from a rumor into a reality, and that reality would reshape the medieval world in ways no one, not even the Pope, could have imagined. It's almost poetic, really. The Church had set out to sanctify war, and in the process it had created something far more potent, the first multinational corporation of the soul. And as history will show, nothing that powerful ever stays holy for long. Imagine the early morning light over Jerusalem, a pale gold haze drifting through the heat, settling softly over the domes and stones. The city still breathes the air of miracles and blood. Pilgrims shuffle along narrow streets, whispering prayers in every language. Merchants haggle in the shadow of sacred ruins, and the sound of distant bells drifts through the desert wind like a memory that refuses to fade. And somewhere among the hills, a line of riders moves slowly, white mantles gleaming, swords at their sides, red crosses stitched over their hearts. The Knights of the Temple. They ride in silence, always in silence. To the people watching they seem otherworldly, not nobles, not monks, something in between. They do not laugh or boast. They rarely remove their helmets in public, and when they pass through a market, the crowd parts as if by instinct. It's said that a Templar's gaze could freeze a man, not with fear, but with the strange gravity of conviction. In that moment, the myth was already being born. The story spread faster than their horses could ride. Word of a brotherhood who answered only to God, men who took no wives, owned no lands, and gave everything to their order, soldiers who prayed before battle and confessed after killing, knights who marched under the sign of the cross but lived by a code sharper than any blade. Europe adored them. The Church, of course, encouraged it. Myths are good for business, and the Templars were perfect propaganda. They embodied everything the papacy wanted the faithful to believe: purity, discipline, divine protection. Sermons compared them to angels with swords. Paintings showed them glowing in battle, untouched by arrows, faces calm in the chaos of holy war. But the truth was more human and, in a way, more beautiful. Most Templars were ordinary men drawn from a world that offered few choices, younger sons of minor nobles who'd inherited nothing, restless adventurers, repentant sinners, and zealots in search of purpose. They joined not because they were fearless, but because the world outside offered even less certainty. And for all its rules and austerity, the temple offered something rare: belonging. In a Europe fractured by war, famine, and class, the Order was one of the few places where a man's worth wasn't defined entirely by birth. Inside the walls of a commandery, everyone wore the same cloak, ate the same bread, followed the same hours of prayer. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, all knelt together before dawn. It was unity by discipline, equality by surrender. And yet, the outside world saw only mystery. They were everywhere and nowhere, riding on crusades, manning castles, managing estates, escorting pilgrims. A traveler might encounter a Templar outpost in the forests of Burgundy, another in the sands of Antioch, another on a cold island in the North Sea, and each one would look exactly the same: white walls, red crosses, silence. They had become an idea that transcended geography. When they rode into battle, their presence was like a symbol made flesh. Chroniclers described them as unbreakable formations of white and red, banners flapping, hooves thundering, lances angled in perfect symmetry. They rode in pairs, one knight, one sergeant, their discipline tighter than any army before them, and they didn't retreat, ever. There's a story, probably exaggerated but worth repeating, that at the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, fewer than 100 Templars helped turn the tide against Saladin's massive army. Outnumbered 20-1, they charged headlong into the desert heat, cutting through enemy lines in a frenzy of faith and exhaustion. When it was over, their commander supposedly knelt in the sand and whispered a single prayer: Non nobis Domine, non nobis sed nomini tuo de gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, but to your name give glory. It's the kind of story medieval Europe lived for, and like all great stories, it spread, changed, and grew until the facts hardly mattered anymore. The Templars were no longer just men. They were a myth in motion. They became shorthand for courage, for purity, for divine purpose. And that, ironically, was the beginning of their undoing. Because the higher a legend rises, the further it has to fall. But for now, they stood at the edge of eternity. Their coffers swelled with donations. Their castles gleamed across Christendom like white stars on a dark sea. Their red cross was the most recognized symbol in Europe. Kings sought their loans. Bishops sought their blessing. Pilgrims sought their protection. It must have felt like destiny, a divine reward for faith and sacrifice. And yet, beneath the surface, something subtle was changing. The order that began with 9 men and a dream was turning into a machine. Their vows of poverty persisted, but their treasuries overflowed. Their humility was genuine, but their power was growing beyond measure. Their lands stretched across thousands of miles. Their archives held contracts and secrets that kings would have killed to read. And because they answered only to the Pope, no monarch, no bishop, no secular court could touch them. They were untouchable, the Church's holy weapon, sharpened to perfection. But history, like the sea, is always shifting. The Crusader states were beginning to crumble. The Muslim world had learned from its defeats and was uniting under stronger leaders. Supply lines were long, morale was short, and faith, that delicate fuel, was flickering. The dream of permanent Christian dominion in the East was dying, and the Templars, who had built their identity on that dream, suddenly found themselves defending something that no longer existed. It's easy, centuries later, to imagine them as fanatics or villains, but maybe they were just men trapped in momentum, unable to stop the wheel they had helped set in motion. By the time their banners fluttered over the last surviving Crusader fortresses, their legend had already outgrown them. In Europe they were saints, in the East they were demons, and in their own hearts, who knows, perhaps a little of both. The ordinary knights must have felt it, the slow decay beneath the glory, the endless wars that achieved nothing, the heat, the sand, the weight of armor, the prayers whispered into silence, the feeling of being instruments of something divine, and yet increasingly something political. But legends don't need clarity, they need symbols, and the Templars had become the most powerful symbol in the medieval world, the perfect fusion of faith and violence. You can almost see it, a banner rippling against a stormy sky, red cross vivid against the white cloth, lightning flashing behind it. To a peasant in a church pew or a monk in a distant cloister, that image meant safety, devotion, and divine justice. To a king in debt, it meant something else entirely. The story of the Templars was no longer being written by saints or chroniclers. It was being rewritten by envy, fear, and ambition. But for now, the curtain hasn't fallen, the candles still burn, the chants still echo in stone halls. The world hasn't yet turned against them. The 9 knights who once huddled beneath the Temple Mount have become an army, a network, a myth. Their legacy has taken on a life of its own, glowing, untouchable, and slightly unreal. And like all myths, it has begun to blur the line between truth and dream. That's where chapter 1 closes, not with an ending, but with a vision of a brotherhood standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. Their swords gleam in the sun, their white cloaks ripple in the desert wind. Behind them, Jerusalem glows like a mirage, and before them, stretching into the horizon, lies the future, glittering, dangerous, inevitable, the dawn of a legend. Chapter 2. The Rise of the Warrior Monks. Imagine standing on a cold morning plain somewhere in France, perhaps Champagne, perhaps Burgundy. The mist still clings to the fields, soft and silver, the kind that blurs the line between land and sky. Out of that fog rides a column of horsemen, their armor dull from travel, their cloaks heavy with dew. But as the light shifts, something crimson catches the dawn, a mark stitched across white cloth, simple yet unmistakable, a red cross. It would become one of the most recognizable symbols in all of human history, but at this moment it is new, modest, a badge of belonging more than power. The men wearing it are quiet, focused, unremarkable to anyone but God. Yet this insignia, this fusion of cloth and conviction, is about to transform them into something the world has never seen, a standing army that answers only to faith. The Templars have begun to evolve. Their days of small vows and secret ceremonies under Jerusalem's ruins are over. The Church has given them legitimacy, a papal seal written in the flowing Latin of divine authority. They are now officially milites Christi, soldiers of Christ, and that single phrase changes everything. With papal backing came money, land, recruits, and something far more valuable, absolution. To die as a Templar was not merely to fall in battle, it was to ascend directly into paradise. No purgatory, no judgment, no delay. The battlefield became a kind of heavenly shortcut. It's hard to overstate how revolutionary that idea was in the 12th century. Medieval Europe was steeped in guilt. Sin was currency. Salvation was a negotiation. And suddenly, here was an order that offered redemption through action, through blood, dust, and obedience. For a restless noble, a wayward knight, or a sinner looking for cosmic forgiveness, the temple was irresistible. The Red Cross symbolized that promise. It wasn't just a banner of war. It was a visible reminder of invisible faith. When a knight knelt before the master of the temple and took his vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, the cross was placed on his cloak as both burden and blessing. From that moment, his life was no longer his own. He would own nothing. He would question nothing. He would fear nothing. And that paradox, total surrender creating total power, became the Templars' greatest strength. Their rules were strict, even monastic. No personal possessions beyond a few garments, no private letters, no hunting, no swearing, no unnecessary conversation. Meals eaten in silence, broken only by the sound of a reader reciting scripture. Even the horses were treated with dignity. No knight was allowed to beat his steed. To the outside world, this was alien. Most knights of the age were brash, boastful, and loud. They wore bright colors, hunted for sport, gambled, bragged about their kills. The Templars, by contrast, moved like shadows, a silent order of disciplined zealots. It's little wonder people began to fear them as much as they admired them. But discipline has a strange beauty to it. Imagine the symmetry of their camp at dawn. White tents in perfect rows, banners hanging still in the air. Each man waking at the same hour, dressing in the same garments, praying the same words. The clang of armor, the rasp of whetstones on steel, the steady rhythm of order in a world of chaos. They were becoming a living embodiment of the medieval dream, unity, faith, and control in a time when everything else seemed to crumble. And when they rode into battle, that unity was terrifying. Templars did not scatter, did not break rank, did not retreat unless ordered. Chroniclers described them as walls of iron, as storms given human form. Their charges were deliberate, almost ritualistic, a prayer in motion. They would advance in complete silence until contact, their lances lowering as one, hooves pounding like a heartbeat. And when the moment came, the cry broke like thunder, Non nobis Domine. Not for us, O Lord, but for you. Then chaos, then history. Every battle became a kind of mass, blood replacing incense, steel replacing song, and the world watched in awe. To the average medieval person, the Templars seemed immortal. When others fled, they stayed. When others hesitated, they rode forward. Stories spread of miraculous victories, of angels fighting beside them, of enemies struck blind by divine light. Whether any of it was true hardly mattered. Faith had become spectacle, but behind the spectacle was a machine. The Templars weren't just warriors. They were administrators, bankers, engineers. Their rule book, the Latin rule, reads like both a spiritual guide and a military manual. Every moment of the day was accounted for, every piece of armor inspected, every coin recorded. Their efficiency was unmatched, and so was their wealth. By the mid-12th century, they controlled estates across Europe, vineyards in France, mills in England, castles in Spain, olive groves in Cyprus. donations poured in from nobles seeking spiritual insurance. And because Templars were sworn to poverty, those donations didn't dissipate, they accumulated. They began lending money to kings, transporting treasure across borders, and safeguarding pilgrims' deposits. If you were traveling to the Holy Land, you could leave your fortune with the Templars in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem. In effect, they invented the medieval checking account. Faith and finance. It's a partnership as old as civilization. But to the Templars, it wasn't greed, it was logistics. Money was a tool for God's work. Armies need supplies, ships, food, fortresses. And if the order had to run the most efficient financial network in Christendom to maintain that mission, so be it. They became, paradoxically, both the humblest and richest men in Europe. Their castles were built like sermons, austere, geometric, designed for endurance, not comfort. No stained glass, no gold leaf, just stone, purpose, and symmetry. Inside, their halls echoed with the quiet rhythm of devotion, the scrape of boots, the murmur of prayers, the metallic whisper of chainmail. To walk into a Templar commandery was to step into another world, a world where faith was function and order was sacred. And yet, for all their restraint, there was grandeur in their simplicity. Their red cross became more than fabric. It became an idea. When people saw it, they saw authority, salvation, and something close to fear. The same emblem that comforted pilgrims terrified heretics. It's strange how power works. The more humble they appeared, the more unstoppable they became. In a way, that red cross marked the beginning of a new era, not just for the Templars, but for the medieval imagination itself. It was the age of symbols, when meaning outweighed truth. A knight's banner could terrify more effectively than his sword. A relic could justify a war. A prayer could bend kings. And no symbol was stronger than that cross. Bold, clean, impossible to ignore. It was faith simplified into geometry. When the sun hit it, it glowed like blood. Some chroniclers wrote that it frightened the enemy before the fighting even began. Others said it calmed the men who bore it. Maybe both were true. Maybe that's the real magic of symbols. They shape both sides of the story. Over the next century, that cross would ride on countless banners across the Holy Land, through dust storms, over dunes, across shattered city gates. It would gleam under the desert sun and soak in the rain of 1,000 sieges. It would be seen by kings, slaves, monks, and merchants alike. And every time it appeared, it carried the same quiet message: obedience, faith, inevitability. From 9 nights came hundreds, then thousands. From humble vows came armies. From silence came history. And still, they prayed before battle, as they always had. Still, they whispered the same words. Still, they believed that death, if it came in service of God, was not an end, but a homecoming. It's easy, centuries later, to romanticize them, to picture gleaming armor, sacred banners, holy purpose. But beneath the poetry was exhaustion. They marched through deserts where the air shimmered like glass. They fought for cities that would fall again within a decade. They believed themselves instruments of divine will. Yet the wars they waged often felt endless, abstract, and hollow. And that contradiction, devotion mixed with futility, is what makes their story so human. By the time the Red Cross became synonymous with power, its wearers had already begun to wonder what it meant. But for now, in this chapter of the story, there is still clarity, still unity, still purpose. The order of the temple stands at its peak, pure, confident, and unstoppable. 1,000 banners ripple in the wind, the sun gleams on polished armor, and the red cross burns like a brand upon the world. The world belongs for a moment to the knights of the temple. Imagine waking before dawn, not to an alarm or the gentle hum of a phone, but to a bell, deep, resonant, and unrelenting. The sound rolls through the dark halls of a stone dormitory, pulling a dozen men from sleep at once. There are no complaints, no yawns, no hesitation. This is a Templar commandery, and the day begins with obedience. Before the first light touches the horizon, the knights are already kneeling, heads bowed, the chill of the flagstones creeping through their woolen tunics. The air smells faintly of oil lamps and damp stone. Someone chants softly from a small book, Latin verses murmured and rhythmic, the sound of faith wrapped in discipline. The Templars did not live like ordinary knights. They lived by the rule of the temple, a sprawling manual written in the 12th century that governed everything from how they prayed to how they chewed. It wasn't just a list of rules, it was a blueprint for turning men into instruments of divine will. The rule began with a simple premise. A knight's soul is weak when his body is indulgent. Every comfort is a temptation, every freedom is a test. So, comfort was eliminated. Templars slept fully clothed, tunic, belt, even their boots close by, ready to ride at a moment's notice. They owned no personal possessions, not even a coin or a comb. Their cloaks and armor belonged to the order, and if something broke, it was repaired or replaced, never personalized. They were forbidden to hunt, to falcon, to gamble, to swear, forbidden from kissing women, even their own mothers or sisters, forbidden from eating meat more than 3 times a week, forbidden from laughter that wasn't humble or restrained. Templar joy was not the joy of feasting or music or wine. It was the quiet satisfaction of obedience, and obedience to them was the purest form of freedom. Every knight took a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the holy trinity of control. But unlike monks who lived behind monastery walls, Templars carried their vows into the world. They were soldiers, but their battlefield was also their monastery. Every act, from sharpening a sword to cleaning a saddle, was a kind of prayer. At dawn, they gathered in the chapel. The service was brief. They were not contemplatives, but men of action. Each prayer was followed by ritual silence. They listened for commands, received their orders, and dispersed without argument. Theirs was a faith built on motion, not meditation. After prayers came breakfast, bread, sometimes cheese, and a cup of watered wine. Meals were eaten in near silence. As they ate, one brother stood at a lectern and read aloud from scripture or from the rule itself, reminding everyone that even the act of eating was a sacred task. The sound of chewing, the scrape of spoons, the droning Latin, it all blended into a rhythm of humility. When they weren't fighting, they worked. Some tended horses, rubbing down the flanks of massive destriers, checking hooves, repairing tack. Others mended chainmail, inspected swords, or organized provisions for long campaigns. A Templar's world was practical, full of physical labor, repetition, and readiness. And yet, beneath all this discipline, there was a strange comfort. The rule removed choice, and with it, uncertainty. A Templar didn't have to wonder what his purpose was. It was written in the rule, enforced by his brothers, and sanctified by God. Every decision had already been made for him. In a world where chaos was normal, where famine, war, and plague struck without warning, that kind of certainty was a luxury few could afford. But of course, it came at a cost. There were moments when the silence must have felt oppressive, when the sameness of days blurred together into a single endless prayer. Imagine years of this life, The same bread, the same rules, the same faces under the same white cloaks. No family, no possessions, no indulgence beyond the thin comfort of faith. And yet, the Templars endured it. Perhaps because the alternative, a world without order, without divine meaning, felt far worse. There's something haunting about their discipline. It wasn't born from cruelty but from conviction. They believed that to serve God they had to strip away everything that made them individual. Ego, desire, even identity itself, all burned away, leaving only function. They became pieces in a sacred machine, and when the machine moved, it moved with terrifying precision. Templars trained relentlessly. Their battle formations were geometric, mathematical, rows of cavalry timed to strike in perfect waves. Each knight knew his place. If one fell, the next filled the gap instantly. Their charges were coordinated like choreography, their retreats executed like clockwork. Their enemies called them demons in white. They didn't scream or taunt or show mercy. They advanced silently until the moment of impact, when they cried out only one phrase: Non nobis Domine, non nobis sed nomini tuo de gloriam. Not to us, O Lord, but to your name be the glory. It was their mantra, their battle hymn, their surrender to something larger than themselves. And yet, despite all this spiritual rigor, the Templars weren't monks lost in abstraction. They were engineers, architects, accountants. They ran farms, managed estates, built fortresses, and oversaw trade routes. Their castles were marvels of design, squat, symmetrical, designed to deflect siege engines and channel attackers into kill zones. But even in architecture, their aesthetic was austere. No ornamentation, no murals, no stained glass, just stone, perfectly aligned, perfectly useful. Templar castles didn't preach beauty, they preached order. Their lives mirrored that architecture. Functional, fortified, minimal. To outsiders, it looked like joyless fanaticism. To the Templars, it was discipline incarnate. Every stone placed, every word spoken, every moment endured was an offering to God. And yet, as centuries passed, cracks began to form. Subtle at first, then spreading. Because discipline without question breeds power, and power, even sacred power, invites suspicion. The Templars' strict hierarchy made them efficient, but it also made them secretive. Their rituals were closed to outsiders. Their vows of silence protected not only their faith, but their operations. Kings and bishops began to whisper, what did these warrior monks do behind closed doors? Did their oaths hide something darker? The rule of the temple, written to sanctify obedience, began to look like a veil. And the more power the order gained, the more castles, the more treasure, the more influence, the more that veil began to draw attention. It's a pattern as old as history. Purity breeds envy, secrecy breeds rumor, and strength breeds fear, but that comes later. For now, imagine one of those long Templar days near its end, the sun dipping low behind battlements, armor hung to dry, the smell of horse sweat and oil in the air. The chapel bells toll again, soft and steady. The knights gather one final time, kneeling in rows, their white cloaks ghost-like in the flickering candlelight. They pray not for victory, not for wealth, not even for peace. They pray for endurance, for the strength to obey again tomorrow and the day after until the end of their lives. Outside, the wind carries the smell of dust and salt. Somewhere beyond the horizon, enemies are gathering, empires are shifting, and history is already writing its next betrayal. But inside the chapel there is only the rhythm of prayer, the faint creak of chainmail, the murmur of Latin words fading into the night. And above them, Carved into the stone arch of the temple wall, the red cross catches the last trace of sunlight, still, unchanging, eternal. For now, imagine the first thing that hits you isn't the sight, but the heat. The air itself feels alive, sharp with salt from the sea, heavy with dust from the desert, and tinged with the scent of oil, incense, and sweat. You've just stepped into the Holy Land sometime around the year 1140, and you're walking through a world where heaven and earth have been fighting for custody of the same patch of ground for generations. The Crusader kingdoms were born from blood and disbelief. After the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099, waves of settlers, soldiers, and zealots streamed eastward, knights chasing absolution, merchants chasing profit, peasants chasing a miracle. What they found was a land older and more complicated than anything they'd been promised. Picture Jerusalem then, not the golden city of postcards, but a dense, sun-bleached labyrinth of limestone walls, narrow streets, and markets bursting with languages: Arabic, Greek, Latin, Armenian, Hebrew, all colliding in the same dusty air. Bells rang from churches while the call to prayer echoed from minarets. Frankish knights and Muslim merchants haggled over silk. Pilgrims shuffled barefoot past relics too sacred to question. The Holy Land was less a battlefield than a mosaic, fragile, shimmering, and always on the verge of breaking. For the Templars, this was both home and battleground. They arrived as guardians of faith but quickly became administrators of empire. They built massive fortresses to anchor the Crusader presence, stone giants rising from the desert like mirages made real. One of their most famous was Crac des Chevaliers, the castle of the knights. If you've ever stood on a cliff and felt the wind try to push you backward, you'll know the feeling of that place. Perched high above the Homs Gap in modern Syria, it was less a castle and more a declaration. Double walls, circular towers, arrow slits that could whisper death at 100 yards. The stones gleamed pale under the sun, and from its ramparts you could see for miles the mountains, the valleys, and the endless horizon of sand and sky. Inside, it was strangely orderly. Kitchens, chapels, barracks, even a bathhouse. You could live there for months without stepping outside, which was convenient, since stepping outside usually meant someone was trying to kill you. The Templars' castles weren't built to impress, they were built to endure. They were a theology of stone, faith expressed in geometry. The Crusader kingdoms themselves were strange hybrids, part European colony, part medieval experiment. French nobles ruled over Middle Eastern cities filled with Syrians, Greeks, and Jews. Mosques stood beside cathedrals. Crusader coins bore Latin inscriptions on one side and Arabic ones on the other. In some ways it worked. Trade flowed, cultures mixed, and for a brief shimmering moment East and West coexisted, not peacefully, but practically. Templars thrived in that liminal space. They spoke local languages, made deals with Muslim rulers, and hired Arab engineers to fortify their walls. Despite their reputation as fanatics, the Templars were pragmatists. They had to be. The Holy Land wasn't a sermon, it was survival. Still, survival came at a price. The heat wore on them, the endless patrols through sand and rock, the smell of blood baked into armor, the weight of divine expectation pressing down like the sun itself. Every campaign was a pilgrimage of exhaustion. Imagine a Templar caravan winding across the desert, horses sweating beneath white banners marked with red crosses, sand grinding in every crevice of armor. They march in silence except for the creak of leather, the occasional clink of mail. Ahead lies an enemy they can't see, only the shimmer of heat on the horizon. By nightfall they camp beneath a vault of stars so clear it feels like a cathedral of light. Prayers are murmured, wounds are tended. The men sleep on bare ground, swords within reach, their faith both pillow and weapon. In this land even the air felt charged with contradiction, sacred and savage all at once, and nowhere was that clearer than in Jerusalem itself. For a brief century the city stood under Christian control, a jewel of Christendom wrapped in ancient dust. The Templars' headquarters was no ordinary building. It was the Al-Aqsa Mosque, believed at the time to stand on the ruins of Solomon's Temple. To the Muslim world it was one of Islam's holiest sites. To the Templars it was the very foundation of their identity, the Temple of Solomon, the birthplace of their name. They turned its halls into barracks, its courtyards into stables, its shadowed corners into places of prayer and secrecy. There, in the dim glow of oil lamps, the Templars trained, planned, and perhaps, as rumors later claimed, uncovered something ancient. Some said they found relics buried beneath the Temple Mount, the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, scrolls of forgotten wisdom. Others said they simply found nothing and invented mystery to fill the void. Whatever the truth, their presence in Jerusalem became mythic. The sight of their white mantles moving through the streets, calm, silent, immaculate, inspired awe and unease in equal measure. They were soldiers of God, but they moved like ghosts. Their faith was practical, but their reputation became supernatural. Pilgrims whispered that Templars could not be killed by ordinary men. Enemies swore they saw them fight after being struck down, and perhaps that was the point. In a land where death was daily and miracles were currency, a little fear was useful. Templar strategy was as psychological as it was martial. They fought not just with swords but with image, the cross on their chest, the silence in their ranks, the absolute certainty in their purpose. Their presence in battle could shift morale before a single blade was drawn. When the call to arms came, whether at Ascalon, Damascus, or Hattin, the Templars rode out not as individuals but as one unbroken will. Their discipline was terrifying. They charged in perfect formation, shields tight, lances lowered, red crosses blazing against white. They were often the first to enter and the last to retreat. In moments when other armies broke, the Templars held, and when they died where they stood. But for all their valor, their victories were temporary. The Crusader kingdoms were built on sand, politically, literally, and theologically. They could conquer cities, but they could never conquer geography. The further they stretched their lines, the thinner their strength became. And while Templars built walls of stone, their enemies built alliances. Muslim leaders like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and eventually the great Saladin began to unify what had once been divided. The dream of Christian dominion over the East began to falter as reality, relentless and strategic, pressed back. Still, for nearly 2 centuries, the Templars endured. They were the spine of the Crusader world, a constant presence whether guarding pilgrims on dusty roads, escorting kings, or defending castles that seemed impossible to hold. And through it all they believed, or at least tried to, that their struggle was holy, that every drop of sweat, every wound, every brother lost was part of a cosmic design. But in quieter moments, as the wars dragged on and the Holy Land slipped further from their grasp, doubt must have crept in. What happens when a holy mission stops feeling holy? When obedience begins to feel like futility? When you've spent your life serving God with sword and blood, and still the world refuses to be saved? History doesn't record their private thoughts. but you can imagine the silence inside those massive stone fortresses, the kind of silence that comes after years of praying into a void. The Templars' castles still stand in ruins across the Middle East, in Syria, in Israel, in Turkey, their stones sun-bleached, their halls open to the wind. Stand in one, and you can almost hear the echoes, hooves on cobblestone, the whisper of chainmail, the low murmur of prayer. Those walls remember. They remember a time when faith and empire shared the same heartbeat, when men rode into battle convinced they were defending heaven itself. And maybe, in their own way, they were. Because for all its contradictions, the Crusader dream wasn't just about conquest, it was about belief, belief so strong it reshaped landscapes, rewrote maps, and built fortresses that still defy time. The Templars were both its architects and its prisoners, bound by duty, by faith, by the unbearable beauty of purpose. And even as the Crusader kingdoms began to crumble, they didn't loosen their grip, they just prayed harder, fought longer, and built higher, until the day came when the walls themselves began to crack. But that's a story for the next night. For now, picture that world one last time, the desert glowing gold under the last light of day, the red cross fluttering above a fortress wall, and somewhere inside, a group of knights kneeling in silence, their faces half-shadowed, their faith still unbroken. The wind moves through the stones like a sigh, the candles flicker, and the Holy Land sleeps, as it always has, torn between heaven and earth. Imagine standing in a candle-lit chamber somewhere in Paris in the early 1200s. The air smells of beeswax and damp stone. At a table sits a man in white robes marked with a red cross, quill poised above parchment. Before him, a merchant lays down a pouch heavy with coins, silver deniers, gold florins, copper dirhams from faraway ports. The knight nods, seals the parchment with wax, and hands the merchant a folded document stamped with the sigil of the temple. "Show this in Jerusalem," he says, "and you'll receive the same sum." The merchant bows, the pouch stays, the man leaves. And just like that, without a single coin crossing a sea, the Knights Templar have just performed one of the earliest forms of international banking. You see, the Templars weren't just warriors, they were administrators, financiers and logisticians of staggering sophistication. While kings still measured their treasuries in piles of glittering metal, the Templars had already learned that information, records, signatures, trust was worth more than gold. Their network stretched from the windswept shores of England to the sun-scorched walls of Jerusalem, a chain of commanderies that functioned as safe houses, training centers, warehouses, and financial hubs all at once. Each of these commanderies was like a small universe, self-sufficient and meticulously organized. They had their own chapels, fields, mills, and workshops. Some raised horses, others produced wool, wine, or grain. Every coin earned was logged, weighed, and sent up the chain, an unbroken current flowing toward the heart of the order. And through this system, the Templars quietly became one of the richest organizations in the medieval world. The irony, of course, is that they began with vows of poverty, but vows are tricky things. The Templars themselves owned nothing. The order owned everything, and that subtle distinction let them accumulate wealth without technically breaking faith. Their financial system worked with an elegance that modern bankers would envy. A pilgrim traveling from London to Jerusalem could deposit money at a temple house in England and receive a coded letter of credit. Along the route, through Paris, Marseille, Acre, and finally to the Holy City, Templar commanderies would honor the note. deduct expenses, and mark it in ledgers kept under strict guard. The traveler never had to risk carrying his fortune across pirate-infested seas or bandit-strewn roads. In a way, the Templars invented something that feels astonishingly modern, a secure international trust network, and unlike kings or nobles, they were trusted by everyone. Christian, Jew, Muslim, it didn't matter. The Red Cross was as good as a vault door. The Templar ledger became a passport through chaos. Picture the roads of Europe in the 13th century, narrow tracks winding through forests and mountains, lined with monasteries, taverns, and thieves. Now picture a convoy of Templar couriers riding fast, cloaked in white, armed but calm. They carried more than messages. They carried secrets, diplomatic letters, royal decrees, coded inventories, even treaties. A letter stamped with the seal of the temple traveled like lightning compared to anything else in the medieval world. And where there were secrets, there were suspicions. People whispered that the Templars had mastered cryptography, that their ledgers contained hidden symbols, that their archives were guarded by curses. In truth, it was discipline, not magic, that kept their system running, but to the medieval mind, efficiency itself felt supernatural. Each regional commandery reported to a central master, who in turn answered to the Grand Master in Jerusalem and later Paris. The chain of communication was ironclad, the discipline absolute. Orders passed down with the precision of a monastic liturgy. Every brother knew his rank, his duty, and the exact limits of his authority. Templar correspondence reveals a world that hummed like a machine. Cargoes of wheat, shipments of crossbow bolts, barrels of wine, all recorded, all accounted for. Even the smallest commandery in rural France or Scotland was part of a vast, synchronized network. A medieval multinational that existed centuries before the word corporation would be invented. And yet, for all this order, there was mystery. The Templar headquarters in Paris, known simply as La Maison du Temple, was a fortress of stone walls and tall towers surrounded by gardens and workshops. Inside lay one of the greatest treasuries in Europe, a glittering hoard of gold, silver, jewels, and documents so valuable that kings themselves stored their wealth there. King Louis VII did. So did Henry III of England. Even the Pope trusted the Templars to manage funds for crusades. When monarchs needed loans, it was often the temple that provided them. When nobles needed to transfer land, the temple served as intermediary. They were accountants of God, and for a time it seemed even heaven owed them interest. But power has a way of creating shadows. As their influence spread, so did envy. Clergy whispered that the Templars had grown too rich, too independent. Kings resented being indebted to monks with swords. Rumors began to drift through Europe like incense, that the Templars worshipped idols, that their rituals were secret and profane, that the cross they bore was not a sign of purity, but of blasphemy. Still, in their heyday, those whispers were little more than background noise. Outwardly, the Templars thrived. Their fortresses dotted Europe and the Levant, solid, silent, identical in style, as if each had been built from the same blueprint. Stone geometry repeating across continents. They didn't just build castles, they built infrastructure, bridges, ports, farms. They managed trade routes that linked the Mediterranean to northern Europe. They established supply lines for crusading armies that stretched across thousands of miles. Without them, the very logistics of holy war might have collapsed. It's easy to forget that behind every knight charging into battle was a chain of bakers, blacksmiths, and scribes keeping the machine running. The Order's power didn't come from miracles. It came from ledgers, but not all their wealth was material. the Templars also held something far more dangerous: information. Through their far-flung network, they gathered intelligence about politics, trade, and warfare from every corner of Christendom. They knew which kings were broke, which roads were unsafe, which alliances were shifting. In an age before newspapers, that knowledge was gold. Their reach was so vast that you could travel from Scotland to Syria and never truly leave their shadow. Every few days' journey, you'd find another Templar house, white walls, red cross, the same rhythm of prayer and order. Their presence was both reassuring and unnerving, like a vast skeleton under the skin of medieval Europe. To ordinary people, they must have seemed immortal. Their discipline never wavered, their symbols never changed. Generations rose and fell, and still the Templars endured, unmoved, unstoppable. Even their dress added to the myth. While nobles flaunted velvet and jewels, Templars wore plain wool, dyed white for purity. Their only ornament was the red cross, a reminder of both sacrifice and authority. When they moved through a town, heads bowed, they looked less like men than like an idea, one that walked and breathed and collected rent. And it wasn't only men. Though the order itself was male, its network included women, nuns, widows, and lay sisters who worked in the commanderies, managing estates, caring for pilgrims, brewing ale, and keeping the wheels turning. History rarely mentions them, but without them, the Temple's empire of faith would have faltered. By the mid-13th century, the Templars had reached their zenith. Their ships carried goods across the Mediterranean. Their estates covered vast tracts of Europe. Their influence seeped into every court, every treasury, every crusade, and yet, like all empires, they had already sown the seeds of their own decline. The Holy Land, their reason for existing, was slipping away. Muslim forces were reclaiming city after city. The Crusader states were shrinking, and with them the spiritual justification for the temple's existence. But the Templars adapted. They shifted their focus westward, becoming less of a crusading order and more of a financial and political one. Their castles became banks, their swords gathered dust, their prayers became ledgers, and with each ledger their power grew. But so did resentment. Imagine being a king and realizing that the most efficient, trustworthy, and wealthy organization in your realm doesn't answer to you. It answers to no one but God, and maybe the Pope. That unease was the first tremor before the fall. But for now, in the candlelit rooms of the 1200s, the world still looked stable. Templar scribes bent over parchment, quills scratched, coins clinked softly in wooden chests. Outside, the moonlight shimmered on stone, and the red cross of the order fluttered faintly in the night wind. It was a world of precision, discipline, and quiet ambition. A world that believed itself eternal. And perhaps, for a while, it was. Picture a long stone hall lit by morning light through narrow slits in the wall. The air smells faintly of straw and cold iron. Dozens of men kneel side by side, white mantles draped over their shoulders, red crosses stark against the fabric. No one speaks. The only sounds are the shuffle of boots, the whisper of breath, and the faint crackle of a torch. It's not a church exactly, not a barracks either. It's both, and that contradiction is the essence of the Knights Templar. Discipline was their creed. Every movement, every word, every thought was governed by the rule of the temple, a sprawling set of commandments written in the early 12th century that blended the rigidity of a monastery with the brutality of a battlefield. And yet, for all its severity, there was beauty in that order, a rhythm that shaped their days like the tolling of distant bells. They rose before dawn to pray, their voices echoing in unison. Then came the chores, feeding horses, sharpening weapons, tending armor, mending cloaks, cleaning wounds. Breakfast was simple: bread, sometimes watered wine, rarely meat. Then training, endless training, sword drills in formation, mounted charges across dusty fields, bow practice until fingers blistered. To the outside world, they were holy warriors. To themselves, they were servants of God, of each other, and of discipline itself. Templars lived by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but those words meant something very different in their world. Poverty meant no personal possessions, but the order itself owned vast estates. Chastity meant avoiding women entirely, even in conversation, an easier rule to write than to live by. And obedience meant complete submission to one's commander, even unto death. That last vow was the hardest, and the one that defined them. A Templar didn't fight for victory. He fought to obey. If ordered to hold a line, he held it. If ordered to die, he died. There was no hesitation, no bargaining, no emotion. In battle, this made them terrifying. Other soldiers might panic, flee, or waver. The Templars never broke formation. Even when surrounded, they fought in silence, red crosses vanishing one by one into the dust. It's tempting to romanticize that kind of devotion, but there was nothing romantic about it. It was hard, mechanical, and often lonely. Templars were forbidden to embrace their own brothers without permission, forbidden to joke or sing frivolously, forbidden to play games of chance. Even laughter was discouraged, except in moderation. Their armor, too, reflected that restraint, plain, functional, unadorned. No bright colors, no gilded crests, only the red cross sewn near the heart. It was said that when the Templars rode into battle, the sound of their charge was unlike anything else. Not the roar of chaos, but the low thunder of synchronized hooves, a kind of terrible harmony. They weren't the largest army in the Crusades, nor the most numerous, but they were the most feared, because the enemy knew they wouldn't stop. Every Templar learned to fight and die as part of something greater, and that mindset extended beyond the battlefield. Inside their commanderies, every task, no matter how small, was done with the same ritual precision. From the folding of cloaks to the cleaning of armor, everything had its method. The order saw chaos as the devil's playground, and order as divine. Imagine the life of a young recruit, a sergeant or a serving brother, joining the temple. He would begin as an associate, working the stables, tending the fields, carrying water. He'd sleep on straw, wake before dawn, pray, eat little, speak less. The nights might seem distant, stoic men of few words, but in truth everyone shared the same weight of silence. Templar silence wasn't emptiness, it was control. They believed words carried danger, pride, gossip, temptation. So they learned to communicate through gestures and glances, through efficiency rather than expression. Meals were eaten in near silence, a monk reading scripture aloud while others chewed. If you wanted salt, you didn't ask, you pointed. If you needed bread, you waited your turn. Over time, that silence became a kind of language, a pulse that connected them more deeply than speech ever could. And perhaps that's why their discipline bordered on the sacred. Their punishments were severe but predictable. A brother who broke his vows, who stole, lied, or behaved pridefully, might be stripped of his cloak, forced to eat on the floor, or made to lie face down during Mass while others stepped over him. For grave offenses, he could be expelled entirely, his red cross torn away like a soul in exile. But for most, it never came to that. The Templar mind was trained like a blade, sharp, steady, and resigned. Even their daily routines reinforced obedience. The day was divided by bells, prayer, labor, rest. Each moment accounted for. They prayed before battle, after battle, before eating, before sleeping. Every act was sanctified, every breath a form of worship. And yet, for all their austerity, there was a quiet humanity beneath it. The rule allowed small comforts, wine on holy days, the company of brothers during feasts, laughter when earned. They kept dogs and falcons. They played music sometimes, though always solemnly. Their lives weren't joyless, just measured. To outsiders, that restraint looked inhuman. To insiders, it was peace. Because here's the thing, medieval life was unpredictable, dangerous, and filthy. Plague, famine, war, it was all chaos. The Templars built a life where everything made sense, a world of routine, duty, and clear purpose. That order was their sanctuary. And yet, there's a strange irony in that. For all their vows of humility, the Templars radiated pride. Not arrogance exactly, but a certainty that they were different, chosen. While other knights fought for lords, women, or glory, the Templars fought for eternity. Their enemy wasn't just flesh and blood, it was sin itself. That certainty gave them strength, but it also made them untouchable. When they marched through cities, people stepped aside. Their white mantles glowed in the sun. Children watched them pass in awe. Priests blessed them. Merchants envied them. Kings tolerated them. And slowly, without realizing it, they became what they were sworn to resist, powerful, privileged, and proud. Their discipline, once spiritual armor, became something colder, a mask. By the late 13th century, the Templar ideal had begun to crack. The Holy Land was lost, the Crusades had soured, and yet the Order still trained, still prayed, still obeyed, as if nothing had changed. It's almost haunting, that image. An army without a war, marching in perfect silence toward a future that no longer needed them. They kept their rituals alive even as their purpose faded. The morning prayers, the vows, the cold meals, the endless drills, like monks in armor performing the same liturgy long after the congregation had gone home. If you had visited a Templar stronghold, then, say, Tomar in Portugal, or the great fortress of Crac des Chevaliers, you'd have seen perfection on the surface, polished discipline, unbroken ranks, but beneath it, something else was stirring, uncertainty. What happens to an order built for holy war when holiness itself goes out of fashion? The Templars didn't have an answer. They just kept obeying. And maybe that's the tragedy. They were so trained to follow command that when the commands themselves became corrupt, when kings and popes turned against them, they couldn't adapt. Their discipline, once their shield, would soon become their downfall. But that's later. For now, in the twilight of their golden age, they still looked unshakable. Picture them one last time, a column of knights riding through the gates of Acre, the last stronghold of Christendom in the east. Sunlight glints on their helmets. The sea wind carries the smell of salt and steel. Their banner ripples, a red cross against white. They move as one body, one will, one faith. And somewhere in the back of the formation, a young knight whispers a prayer he has said 1,000 times before. He doesn't know that in a few short decades, his order will be ashes and rumor. But in this moment, he is calm, because obedience is peace. And for the Knights Templar, peace, however fleeting, was always worth dying for. Chapter 3. Secrets, Shadows, and Heresy. Imagine the stillness beneath Jerusalem. The air is cool, dry, and old, older than the Crusaders who came here with dreams of salvation and plunder. Torches flicker against ancient stone, illuminating tunnels carved centuries before the birth of Christ. The sound of footsteps echoes faintly, rhythmic and deliberate. These men wear no crowns, no jewels, only white mantles marked with a red cross. 9 knights, poor, pious, exhausted, descending under the ruins of Solomon's temple. At least that's the story. The first whisper in a legend that would stretch across continents and centuries. According to chroniclers, when the Knights Templar were founded around 1119, their official mission was humble: to protect Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous road from Jaffa to Jerusalem. In reality, there were only 9 of them, hardly enough to guard a single caravan. And yet King Baldwin II of Jerusalem gave them quarters in one of the holiest sites on earth, the Temple Mount, believed to be the ruins of Solomon's temple itself. That's where the name came from, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. But for a group of destitute knights, their address was suspiciously prestigious. The Temple Mount was not just another ruin, it was a sacred puzzle layered in myth. Jews believed it was where the Ark of the Covenant had once rested. Muslims revered it as the site of the Prophet's ascent to heaven. Christians saw it as the home of God's wisdom and wrath alike. And somehow these 9 knights, without royal blood, without political clout, were allowed to live directly atop it. And for nearly 9 years, no one quite knew what they were doing down there. There are no surviving records, no letters, no official reports, just silence, the kind that history fills with imagination. And centuries later, that silence became the perfect soil for mystery. Some say the Templars were digging, not guarding, that they searched the ruins for hidden relics, ancient scrolls, or lost knowledge buried deep beneath Jerusalem. According to certain accounts, the knights conducted excavations under the temple itself, tunneling through ancient chambers that had lain untouched since biblical times. Archaeologists in the 19th century actually found evidence of Templar tunnels beneath the site, narrow shafts and corridors leading nowhere, carved by human hands during the Crusader period. That's when the myth took root, that the Templars had uncovered something extraordinary, something that transformed them from a handful of ragged knights into one of the most powerful organizations in the medieval world. What was it? The Ark of the Covenant? The Holy Grail? Secret knowledge from King Solomon himself? Or perhaps something less tangible? A myth so potent it didn't need to exist to be believed. It's easy to see why the story stuck. The Templars' rise defied logic. They appeared out of nowhere, impoverished, under-equipped and obscure. Then, almost overnight, they became legends. Their fame spread through Europe like wildfire. Popes blessed them. Kings donated land. The church gave them privileges no other order had ever held. They could collect tithes, build fortresses, even run their own banks. Within decades, they were richer and more influential than most monarchies. How does that happen unless you've found something powerful? Of course, the historian in us can explain it rationally. Europe was full of eager donors. The Crusades were romanticized as a holy cause. The Church wanted soldiers who could fight without being corrupted by greed, and the Templars fit that image perfectly. Their vows of poverty made them trustworthy. Their discipline made them effective. Their myth was self-reinforcing, but reason rarely wins the imagination. And so the legend persisted that beneath the stones of the Temple Mount, they discovered secrets the Church itself feared, hidden teachings, forbidden wisdom, proof that faith was not as simple as it seemed. You can almost hear the whispers, a flicker of torchlight in the dark, the scrape of metal against stone, the muttered Latin of a prayer or a spell. It's nonsense, of course, probably, but beautiful nonsense. That's the curious power of the Templar myth. It lives in the gap between faith and doubt, between the seen and the unseen. Take the idea of the Grail, for instance. In medieval Europe, the word didn't mean a chalice at first. It meant a vessel of divine mystery, something that contained the essence of truth. The connection between the Templars and the Grail only appeared centuries later, in 12th and 13th century romances, when poets like Chrétien de Troyes began weaving stories of knights, purity, and hidden relics. Those tales weren't history. They were dreams, but dreams with staying power. To the medieval mind, it made perfect sense that the holiest warriors would be the keepers of the holiest object. And to the modern mind, still restless in the dark, it makes perfect sense that an empire's rise must hide a secret. Maybe that's why the Templars continue to haunt us. Because we can't resist the idea that someone, somewhere, found the truth and kept it to themselves. But beneath the mystique, there's something more mundane and more fascinating. The real secret of the Templars wasn't gold or relics. It was organization. While other crusader groups floundered in chaos, the Templars built a system. They turned faith into logistics. They mastered record-keeping, finance, communication, and property management at a level Europe had never seen before. Their commanderies stretched from Scotland to Syria, forming a network that could move money, men, and messages faster than any king's court. They were medieval globalists, an early blueprint for the international corporation. That was their real treasure, their true grail, not buried under Jerusalem, but written in ledgers and sealed with wax. Still, it's fun to imagine the other version, the one where those 9 knights, by flickering torchlight, brushed away centuries of dust and found something that made them more than soldiers, something that whispered of destiny, because that's the romantic engine of the Templar myth, that somewhere in their cold discipline and rigid faith, they touched a kind of forbidden light. Maybe it wasn't treasure. Maybe it was understanding. The church would later accuse them of heresy, of denying Christ, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping strange idols, all of which sound absurd, until you remember how much they changed between those first 9 nights and the empire they became. Power always transforms faith, sometimes subtly, sometimes completely. And perhaps in those long tunnels beneath the temple, the transformation began. There's a moment, halfway between legend and history, when we can almost see it. 9 men on their knees, torches flickering, the stones around them whispering echoes of the past. They think they're praying, but maybe, in that silence, something ancient is listening. And maybe that's why the myth still holds us. Because even if the Templars never found the Ark or the Grail or any secret knowledge at all, they still uncovered something remarkable, the power of belief itself. They discovered how mystery can move empires. Imagine a candle-lit chapel deep in the hills of France. The walls are rough stone, the air thick with incense and dust. In the dim light, the symbol of the Red Cross flickers faintly across banners and shields stacked neatly against the wall. A handful of knights kneel in silence before an altar, not before the crucifix, but before something older, stranger, covered in a cloth of deep red. No one speaks, only the low chant of prayer, rhythmic and hypnotic, filling the space like the hum of bees in a summer field. This is the image that has haunted storytellers for centuries. The idea that the Knights Templar possessed secret knowledge, perhaps even a relic of impossible power. And like all the best myths, it's never quite clear whether we want it to be true or whether we enjoy believing it's hidden. The legend of the Holy Grail, for instance, didn't actually begin with the Bible. It began with poets. Around the late 12th century, when the Templars were at their most powerful, A French poet named Chrétien de Troyes wrote of a mysterious grail, a shining vessel carried in a sacred procession, capable of granting eternal nourishment and divine wisdom. He never called it holy, nor said it was a cup. Later, writers turned it into the chalice of Christ, the cup of the Last Supper, or the vessel that caught his blood at the crucifixion. But in Chrétien's day, the Grail was simply something too sacred to name directly. And in that ambiguity, the Templars found a shadow, because who else fit the image better? Knights of divine mystery, warriors of impossible devotion, a brotherhood whose rituals were secret, whose vows were absolute, and whose origins lay under the ruins of Solomon's Temple. To a medieval audience it made perfect sense. If the Grail existed, it was the Templars who kept it. Over the centuries, the Grail and the Templars fused together into a single enduring myth, a marriage of chivalry and mysticism that no amount of historical evidence has ever been able to undo. The truth, though, is both smaller and more interesting. The Templars were bureaucrats of the divine. They didn't sit around sipping from golden chalices or unlocking cosmic secrets. They balanced books. They managed estates. They wrote letters in crisp Latin. They were the spiritual accountants of a holy empire. But because they lived in an age obsessed with relics, bones of saints, drops of Christ's blood, splinters of the true cross, they were inevitably drawn into the world of the sacred object. They guarded reliquaries. They escorted pilgrims who sought miraculous artifacts. They helped fund and protect monasteries where fragments of supposed holy items were displayed. So when rumors spread that they had discovered ancient scrolls beneath the Temple of Solomon, texts written by early Jews, Gnostics, or even pre-Christian mystics, the stories stuck. The scroll myth would grow and mutate over time. Some later accounts, centuries after the Templars were gone, claimed they had found the Book of Thoth, an Egyptian text of divine wisdom. Others said they uncovered teachings from the lost tribes of Israel, and some whispered of alchemical diagrams, maps of the cosmos itself, hidden away from the church to protect humanity from knowledge it wasn't ready to bear. Of course, there's no evidence for any of this, but myths thrive where evidence fails, and perhaps that's what made the Templars so irresistible to later imaginations. They embodied that perfect combination of real power and secret silence. The church itself fueled much of it, unintentionally, because the Templars, though loyal to Rome, answered to no king, no bishop, no worldly authority. They were free to move money, land, and information across borders. They could send coded letters that no one else could read. They had their own internal justice system, their own chapels, their own prayers. In other words, they looked a lot like the very thing the church feared most, a second church. And that's when suspicion began to bloom. Whispers spread that the Templars practiced strange rituals, that their initiations involved renouncing Christ, spitting on the cross, or worshipping a mysterious head called Baphomet, that their power came not from God but from something older. Most historians agree that these accusations were lies, propaganda created to destroy them later. But it's worth noting why those lies were so effective. Because they sounded plausible. Because secrecy always invites projection. If you give people a locked door, they will imagine what's behind it. And for medieval Europe, already steeped in apocalyptic fear and superstition, the Templars became the perfect vessel for that imagination. Their very success became suspicious, their discipline unnatural, their wealth sinful, their silence heretical. And yet, maybe there was something beneath all the rumor. Not magic, not relics, but an attitude. See, the Templars didn't pray like other monks. Their spirituality wasn't cloistered, it was militant. Their daily life was about control, obedience, and the annihilation of the self. Every moment of pleasure, every trace of comfort was stripped away to make room for purpose. In a sense, that was a kind of secret knowledge, the knowledge that faith and suffering could be fused into a single weapon. And that's what made them so dangerous. Not to the Muslims they fought in the Holy Land, but to the church that eventually feared them, because the Templars didn't seem to need intermediaries. Their faith was too direct, too efficient, too pure. When you can talk to God through action, you make priests nervous. By the time the Crusader kingdoms began to crumble, the Templars' mystique had already surpassed their usefulness. Europe no longer needed warrior monks. It needed bankers, diplomats, and obedient clergy, and so the Templars' mysticism, once admired, became suspect. It's strange, isn't it, how quickly a symbol of holiness can become a symbol of heresy. One century they were Christ's chosen, the next they were whispered to be sorcerers. But perhaps that's the price of mystery. The more tightly you guard your secrets, the easier it is for others to fill them with darkness. And in the quiet moments when we think of the Templars by torchlight, kneeling before something hidden under silk, we feel that same tension, that blend of awe and suspicion, that uneasy beauty of something half-believed. Because part of us wants to believe. We crave hidden truths. We need our mysteries, especially the ones that refuse to resolve. And maybe that's why, centuries later, the Templar myth is still alive, in Dan Brown novels, in video games, in conspiracy theories whispered on YouTube at 3 a.m., because it scratches that ancient itch, that somewhere, someone knows something we don't. It's funny how little we've changed. The medieval mind looked at the stars and imagined divine design. We look at old ruins and imagine lost technology. Both are acts of yearning, proof that we are wired to believe that history hides something from us. And perhaps the Templars were the first to realize that the greatest power isn't in what you know, but in what others think you might know. Theirs was a religion of silence, and silence in any age is seductive. Imagine the city of Jerusalem in the morning light. The walls are pale gold, dust drifting through narrow streets where merchants lift their shutters and donkeys stamp impatiently in the shade. From the hills beyond, the desert glows like a sea of faded fire. Bells ring from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and somewhere a muezzin's call answers softly from across the valley. This was the city the Templars swore to defend, the heart of their purpose, the reason for their existence. But by the late 12th century, Jerusalem was no longer the eternal prize they once imagined. It had become a coin tossed endlessly between empires, each claiming divine right, none able to hold it for long. The cracks began, as they so often do, with pride. The Crusader kingdoms, those fragile Latin states carved out after the First Crusade, had grown decadent and divided. The descendants of knights who once marched barefoot to holy war now lived like minor kings, drinking imported wine, bickering over titles, and marrying into local dynasties to secure land and dowries. The Templars, meanwhile, had become something very different from their humble beginnings. They were no longer 9 men kneeling in the dust. They were a multinational corporation of the Middle Ages, thousands strong, with property stretching from Scotland to Syria. They operated fleets, fortresses, and treasuries. They could lend money to kings and fund crusades outright. And that kind of power, while impressive, makes enemies quickly. By the mid-11th century, the balance of the Holy Land had shifted. Muslim forces, long divided, were now uniting under a single banner, led by a man who seemed born for the role, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. known in the West as Saladin. If the Crusaders were a tangle of arrogance and infighting, Saladin was the opposite, disciplined, patient, and devout. His armies were not the wild hordes described in European rumor. They were organized, loyal, and most importantly, fighting for home. The Templars met them on countless fields, Hattin, Ascalon, Arsuf, and though they fought with ferocious resolve, they were outmatched by unity and strategy. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 was the breaking point. It began with a cruel trick of the sun. Saladin's army lured the Crusaders away from their water supplies, dragging them across the dry Galilean plains under a blazing July sky. By the time the Templars reached the horns of Hattin, they were half mad with thirst, their chainmail burning against their skin, their banners wilting in the heat. The Muslim forces surrounded them. Archers darkened the sky with arrows, smoke from burning grass choked the air, and when the fighting finally stopped, almost the entire Crusader army was dead or captured. The True Cross, a relic carried into battle like a talisman, was seized by Saladin's men. It was never seen again. The Templar Grand Master Gerard de Riedfort was taken alive. Saladin spared him, though many of his brothers were executed. He would live long enough to watch the walls of Jerusalem fall later that same year. When word reached Europe that the Holy City was gone, it was as if the world itself had cracked open. Sermons thundered across cathedrals, blaming sin, pride, and divine wrath. Monarchs trembled, pilgrims wept. The Pope called for another crusade, and through it all, the Templars stood in the ruins of their purpose. You can almost imagine the silence that followed. The once sacred city, its streets littered with the detritus of war, now echoed with the sounds of new rulers. The Templar headquarters on the Temple Mount was emptied, their altars dismantled, their treasures seized. What began as a holy mission now looked suspiciously like a failure of faith. For the first time, the Templars were without their holy ground, and without Jerusalem. They were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. If the temple was gone, what exactly were they the knights of anymore? But endings have a way of becoming beginnings. Driven from the holy city, the Templars retreated to the coast, to Acre, Tyre, and Cyprus, where they rebuilt themselves as the guardians of ports and pilgrims rather than of the temple itself. Their castles became symbols of endurance. Crac des Chevaliers in Syria rose like a stone crown over the hills, its walls layered and massive, designed to resist even the most determined siege. Safed Tortosa, Athlit, each fortress a defiant miracle of engineering, built with geometry, patience, and faith in stone. In those high towers, the Templars kept the flame of their order alive. But it was different now, less about holy destiny, more about survival. Their discipline hardened into something colder. Their prayers became shorter, their eyes sharper. They trained recruits not to imagine glory, but to endure isolation, hunger, and the dull ache of endless duty. And yet, despite all this loss, their legend somehow grew. Europe romanticized them even as the Holy Land slipped away. Chroniclers back home painted the Templars as holy martyrs, holding back the tide of heathens. Donations poured in. New recruits arrived from noble families eager for redemption. It's one of history's great ironies. The worse they failed in the East, the more powerful they became in the West. But under the surface, something had changed. Their order was no longer about the sacred geography of Jerusalem. It was about the machinery of power, and in that subtle shift from spiritual to financial, the seeds of their downfall were already being sown. When the Crusades began, the Templars fought for the soul of Christendom. By the 13th century, They were its bankers. They lent to kings and nobles, secured transport for crusading armies, and managed estates that rivaled monasteries in wealth. Their temples in Paris, London, and Aragon became repositories for gold and secrets. Some said their vaults held the lost relics of the East. Others whispered that beneath their churches, tunnels led to rooms where initiates swore oaths in candlelight, swearing not to crown or cross, but to something older. In truth, those basements probably held nothing more exotic than ledgers and coin chests, but perception, as always, was more dangerous than reality. To kings in debt, the Templars' wealth was an insult. To the Church, their independence was heresy. And so, while the Templars rebuilt their fortresses and continued their crusading vows, the world around them quietly changed. New powers rose, old faiths fractured. Europe began to turn inward, to trade, to politics, to profit. The dream of Jerusalem faded like smoke on the horizon. The Templars became relics themselves, living fossils of an age of faith that no longer fit the world they helped create. And perhaps that's the tragedy at the heart of their story. They were men who built a system so efficient, so disciplined, that it outlasted their original purpose. Their creed was supposed to die with Jerusalem, but it didn't. It calcified. It spread through Europe's veins, into its banks, its armies, its bureaucracies. Even as they prayed for salvation, they were laying the groundwork for capitalism, for modern finance, for the idea that faith could be managed like currency. When you think about it, that might be their most heretical legacy of all. In the distance, though, back on those coastal walls, you can almost still hear the wind off the sea whistling through the battlements of Acre. The Templar banners still flutter there in imagination, crimson crosses fading against the salt air. They never stopped believing they could reclaim the Holy Land. They never stopped waiting for the day the horns would sound again. But faith, like empire, has tides, and the tide was already receding. Imagine standing on the ramparts of Acre at twilight. The sea stretches endlessly westward, glowing copper beneath the dying sun. Seagulls drift above the harbor where broken ships list in the water, their masts creaking softly. Behind you, the wind carries the scent of smoke and salt, and the low, steady hum of prayer from men who know the end is coming. This is the world of the final crusades, not the holy fire of the first generation, not the fevered marches of kings and saints, but a quieter, more desperate echo. The age of glory was over. What remained was a grim, bureaucratic persistence. Wars fought on borrowed faith, borrowed time, and borrowed money. By the late 13th century, the Kingdom of Jerusalem existed mostly on parchment and in memory. Its capital, if one could call it that, was Acre, a coastal city pressed between a restless sea and endless desert. It was crowded, rich, and tense, a city of pilgrims, traders, and soldiers living shoulder to shoulder in uneasy tolerance. Here the Knights Templar had built their final fortress, a marvel of engineering, all white stone and iron gates, its walls thicker than any catapult could breach. Within those walls, gold and relics were stored in vaults beneath torchlit halls. Above them, in chapels that echoed with Latin chants, the Templars still prayed for Jerusalem, though most knew they would never see it again. They had become the custodians of a dream already dying. The last crusades were not holy wars anymore. They were logistics operations, charters, supply lines, contracts. The romantic image of knights charging across the desert had long since been replaced by the grinding reality of politics. Kings back in Europe promised armies and delivered excuses. Popes issued bulls calling for redemption and sent none. The Templars and their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller, did what they could. They fortified the remaining coastal strongholds, trained recruits from France and England, and negotiated uneasy truces with Muslim rulers, who now viewed them less as enemies and more as relics of a fading age. For nearly a century, the Templars held their line. A few miles of coast, a handful of towers, and the weight of an entire lost empire on their shoulders. Then, in 1291, the inevitable came. A vast Mamluk army, disciplined, relentless, and armed with the confidence of history, swept across the plains toward Acre. Their banners blackened the horizon. Their engines rolled like thunder. Inside the city, panic spread like wildfire. Citizens fled to the harbor, merchants burned their ledgers, priests carried relics to the ships, whispering prayers that no one believed would work. The Templars, as always, took their positions. From the battlements, they could see the Mamluk campfires stretching endlessly into the desert night. The siege began with drums, then fire, then days of unbroken assault. It was not the glorious last stand of legend. It was chaos. Stones crashed into the towers, arrows rained like iron hail, walls cracked and bled dust. The Templars fought with methodical silence, their discipline unbroken even as everything around them burned. Eyewitnesses would later write that when the outer wall finally collapsed, the sound was like a mountain giving way. Within days, Acre was gone. The Templar fortress fell piece by piece, and those who survived fled to their ships, carrying little more than their order's banner and the bitter taste of failure. When the city burned behind them, so did the last true Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land. It was over. The Crusades had lasted nearly 2 centuries, and now, after all the pilgrimages, sieges, and sermons, the Holy Land was once again entirely in Muslim hands. For the Templars, the loss was more than strategic, it was existential. They returned to Europe as an army without a battlefield, an order without a purpose. Their castles in the east were gone, their mission obsolete, but they were still wealthy, still disciplined, and still bound by vows that made them useful or dangerous, depending on who was watching. They settled mostly on the island of Cyprus, rebuilding their headquarters there. From its harbors, they continued to dream of returning to the Holy Land, though it was clear to everyone that the age of crusades had passed. But faith is a stubborn thing. The Templars still believed that their duty was not complete. They trained, prayed, and planned as if the next crusade was always just one papal decree away. And Europe for a while humored them. Popes still called them the sword of the church. Kings still borrowed their money. Peasants still whispered prayers for them. But under the surface, the world was changing. Trade was replacing war. Cities were replacing castles. Banks were replacing swords. And the Templars, with their vast holdings and network of treasuries, found themselves at the uncomfortable center of this transition. They had invented the closest thing to modern finance, a system where a pilgrim could deposit gold in Paris and withdraw it in Acre using coded letters of credit. It was genius, practical, and efficient, and in hindsight, catastrophic. Because when the wars ended and the debts came due, kings looked at the Templars' wealth and saw temptation, not salvation. Especially one king in particular, Philip IV of France. Philip was a man both pious and paranoid. He owed the Templars enormous sums of money, loans for his wars, his court, his vanity. But he also saw their independence as an affront. They answered not to him, but to the Pope. Their fortresses in France were like miniature states, their archives sealed and secret, and the more Philip learned about them, the more their silence unnerved him. Rumors spread of strange initiation rites, of heretical symbols, of men kissing the cross in reverse. Nonsense, most likely, but for a monarch looking to erase his debts and consolidate power, nonsense can be weaponized. In the years after Acre, Philip began to scheme. He courted the Pope, then bullied him. He planted spies among the Templars. He listened to gossip and invented the rest. The Templars, perhaps naively, continued to operate as they always had, holding mass, training knights, managing estates. They trusted in their reputation, in their service, in their holy mission. They never realized that while they were guarding against heathens abroad, the real danger had been quietly gathering at home. In the fall of 1307, France was restless. Taxes were high, the treasury was strained, and the king's legitimacy was fragile. Philip needed an enemy. And what better villain than a secretive, wealthy brotherhood whose glory had long since faded into rumor? The Templars were about to learn a lesson the Romans once taught long ago, that power without narrative is just a target. Their story had begun with oaths whispered beneath the Temple of Solomon. It was about to end in the flicker of torches and the hiss of sealed orders. History, like the sea, has its own rhythm, rising, falling, devouring. The Templars, once masters of both faith and war, had finally drifted too far from shore. Their banners would not fall on the battlefield, but in the courts of kings. Their last enemy would not wield a sword, but a quill. The Crusades had ended, but the Inquisition was just beginning. Imagine Paris in the early morning of October 13th, 1307. The air is cold, the mist heavy. Bells toll softly from the towers of Notre Dame, their echo rolling over the Seine. Most Parisians are still asleep, unaware that within the hour history itself is about to shift. Across the city, a quiet army stirs. Royal messengers slip through fog-damp alleys, carrying sealed orders bearing the king's personal wax seal. Soldiers, sworn to secrecy, assemble at street corners and bridges. They don't yet know who they're hunting, only that the order comes directly from Philip IV, and that disobedience would mean ruin. When the sun finally breaks the horizon, the trap is sprung. Every Templar house in France, every fortress, every commandery, every quiet estate hidden among vineyards and fields is surrounded. Gates splinter, iron boots echo down stone halls. The knights of the temple, warriors who once faced Saracen armies in the blazing deserts of Palestine, are dragged from their beds half-dressed, bewildered, accused of crimes so grotesque they can barely comprehend them. Blasphemy, idolatry, heresy. The list reads like something pulled from a fever dream, but this was no dream. It was politics, dressed in the robes of faith. Let's be clear, Philip IV was not a fool. He was something more dangerous, clever, desperate, and convinced of his divine right to do whatever was necessary to hold his kingdom together. He had bled France dry with wars against England, then with his campaigns to tax the clergy. When the church resisted, he struck back, exiling the Pope from Rome, installing his own candidate, and essentially turning the papacy into a branch office of the French crown. That Pope was Clement V, a man whose spine was as soft as the velvet cushions he sat on. Officially, he ruled from Rome. In practice, he lived under the shadow of Philip's will, a papal puppet relocated to Avignon. And so, when the King of France whispered that the Templars were dangerous, heretics, maybe even satanic, Clement listened. But the real accusation wasn't spiritual, it was financial. The Templars held vast wealth, not in piles of coins, but in something far more threatening: records, ledgers, IOUs. They were Europe's most sophisticated bankers, managing royal treasuries, facilitating trade, and holding deposits from nobles who trusted their vaults more than their own castles. That included Philip himself, who now owed them so much that, if they called in their debts, France might collapse. And so, with one order, Philip did what every indebted man has dreamed of doing since time began. He erased the balance sheet. The raids were coordinated with surgical precision. Templars across France were seized simultaneously, their archives confiscated, their leaders imprisoned. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was arrested in Paris, along with his top commanders. He had been a guest of honor at the king's court just days before, attending the funeral of Philip's sister. Now his hospitality was rewarded with chains. The interrogations began almost immediately. The king's agents, men of ink and iron, demanded confessions to every sin imaginable. They accused the Templars of denying Christ, of spitting on the cross during initiation, of worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet. They spoke of obscene rituals, secret kisses, and dark oaths taken by candlelight. And under torture, men will say anything. By the week's end, confessions poured in, broken, contradictory, desperate. Some swore they had been tricked, others simply wept and signed whatever parchment was placed before them. The king had his proof. But outside the dungeons, the world was less convinced. The charges made no sense. The Templars were fanatically religious, sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their prayers structured their lives so tightly that even eating and sleeping were acts of devotion. To accuse them of heresy felt like accusing monks of witchcraft. But logic was irrelevant. The spectacle was the point. Philip had turned the trial into theatre. He invited clergy, nobles, and the public to hear the confessions. He displayed the trembling knights as examples of corruption and divine justice. He presented himself as the defender of Christendom, cleansing it of hidden rot. And for a public weary of taxes, famine, and failed wars, it worked. People love a villain, especially one that used to be untouchable. Meanwhile, Clement V hesitated. As head of the church, the Templars were technically under his jurisdiction, not Philip's, and he knew, deep down, that the charges were absurd. He issued cautious letters demanding the Templars be handed over to papal investigators, but Philip ignored him. France was already playing judge, jury, and executioner. When the Pope finally summoned his courage to intervene, the damage was done. Across Europe, the accusations had spread like wildfire. Other kings, seeing opportunity, followed Philip's lead. Why not confiscate a few Templar estates? Why not seize their gold, their horses, their lands? After all, if France was purging the heretics, who wanted to look soft on sin? One by one, Europe's monarchs turned on their former protectors. In England, Edward II hesitated at first. He actually liked the Templars, but papal pressure forced his hand. In Spain and Portugal, the order was dissolved and reborn under new names, with new insignia, to preserve their assets while appeasing the church. In Germany and Italy, their properties were quietly absorbed by the Hospitallers, rivals who had survived by being slightly less rich and slightly less suspicious. But in France, there was no mercy. The king's prisons overflowed with knights. Some recanted their forced confessions, and for that they were burned alive. Others were kept in darkness for years, their order formally disbanded by papal decree in 1312. As the walls closed in, Jacques de Molay remained calm. His life, by then, had been one long act of faith. He had fought in Outremer, negotiated with kings, and seen the fall of Acre. He knew what it was to lose everything. But this betrayal, this twisting of faith into a weapon, was something colder. He endured years of imprisonment, interrogation, and humiliation before being brought once more into public view. On March 18th, 1314, the king staged one final spectacle. Molay and 3 senior Templars were led onto a platform erected on the Ile de la Cité, a small island in the Seine, directly across from the royal palace. The crowd gathered in silence, expecting confessions and repentance. But instead the old man, gaunt, weary, his hair turned white in prison, stood tall and spoke words that would echo for centuries. He retracted every confession, declared the order innocent, condemned the lies, the cruelty, the injustice. The crowd gasped. The executioners hesitated. Even Philip's officials seemed unsure what to do. But the king, unmoved, ordered the fires lit immediately, and as the flames climbed, witnesses said Jacques de Molay did not scream. He stood, unmoving, until the smoke swallowed him. According to legend, with his final breath, he called down a curse, summoning the Pope and the King to meet him before God within a year. It sounds like myth, but here's the strange part. Both men did die within 12 months. Philip collapsed suddenly during a hunting trip. Clement succumbed to illness not long after. Their bodies, it was said, refused to rest peacefully. One burned, one desecrated by lightning. History, for once, indulged in poetic justice, and so ended the Knights Templar, at least on paper. Their castles were seized, their treasure vanished, their order dissolved, but their legend, that refused to die. Whispers began immediately, of ships slipping away from La Rochelle under cover of night, carrying gold, relics, and sacred texts, of surviving knights who fled north to Scotland or vanished into the Alps, of secret brotherhoods, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, who claimed descent from the last guardians of the temple. It's hard to tell where history ends and myth begins. Maybe they're the same thing now, a story too powerful to stay buried. The fires of Paris went out, the ashes scattered. But in the imagination of every generation since, the Templars never stopped riding. Their red crosses still gleam faintly in the dark corners of our collective memory, where faith and conspiracy meet like two mirrors reflecting forever. Chapter 4. The Fall, the Curse, and the Immortal Legend. Take a deep breath and picture it again. Paris, 1314. The sun setting behind the grey spires, the river glinting like a blade, the crowd dispersing after the execution, their murmurs fading into the wind. For a moment, the city feels hollow. The flames have gone out, the smoke has thinned, and all that remains of the Knights Templar is the faint scent of burning oak and the whisper of rumour. It should have ended there, but history, like fire, has a way of smouldering long after the last spark dies. They say Jacques de Molay's final words were a curse. He called out from the pyre, summoning Pope Clement and King Philip to appear before the judgment of God within a year. The legend says his voice did not tremble. It carried through the crowd, past the walls of Paris, past the gilded windows of the royal palace, carried by the smoke as if heaven itself were listening. And then, as the flames consumed him, something strange happened. The air shifted. The crowd fell silent. Even the guards who had lit the pyre looked uneasy, like men who had just seen something they shouldn't have. You can almost hear the echo, soft, defiant, and final. Within 1 year you will answer before God. It's the kind of line that sounds too neat to be true. And yet, history, either by coincidence or poetic design, obliged. Within a month, the Pope fell ill. Clement V's body gave out after years of stress, guilt, and compromise. His corpse was placed in a monastery awaiting burial, but as if on cue, the monastery caught fire. The flames consumed the chamber, and the papal body, already lifeless, was said to have sat upright in the coffin, engulfed in flames, as though the curse had come to collect. Not long after, King Philip went hunting in the forest of Fontainebleau. A strong, healthy man, still in his 40s, he rode out in the crisp autumn air and never returned alive. Accounts differ. Some say he fell from his horse, struck his head, and lingered for days in agony. Others say he was seized by a sudden paralysis. Either way, the most powerful man in Europe died slowly, staring into nothing, as if haunted by something he couldn't see, and with their deaths, the curse of the Templars was born. It was a simple story. 2 men destroyed by the vengeance of a martyred knight, but it grew quickly. People whispered that France itself was doomed, that Philip's descendants, the Capetian line, would die out within generations, and, strangely enough, that too came true. Within less than 2 decades, all 3 of Philip's sons, each having worn the crown, were dead without heirs. The dynasty that had ruled France for centuries was snuffed out like a candle in a storm. The people of the time called it la malédiction des Templiers, the Templar curse. To later generations, it became a parable, a warning about greed, corruption, and the strange persistence of divine justice. Of course, historians will tell you it was all coincidence, and maybe they're right. But that's the beautiful thing about history. It leaves just enough cracks for the imagination to pour through. When you close your eyes and think of those final days, it's not hard to believe that something larger was at work, a kind of cosmic balancing act, subtle and cruel. The Templars, who had built their order on discipline, loyalty, and faith, had been betrayed by those who claimed to uphold the same virtues. And perhaps, just perhaps, the universe took notice. Yet even as their bodies turned to ash, their legend began to breathe again. Within a generation, stories of the hidden treasure of the temple began to surface. Gold, relics, and ancient knowledge spirited away from France before the arrests. Ships loaded in secret at the port of La Rochelle, sailing west into the mist. Some claimed they vanished into Scotland, others into Portugal, and some said they crossed the ocean itself, centuries before Columbus, to lands unknown. The myth of the lost Templar fleet became the fuel for countless tales. Sailors swore that on stormy nights they'd seen ghost ships bearing red crosses on their sails, gliding silently across the waves. Monks whispered of secret vaults beneath cathedrals where the last Templars hid sacred relics, and among peasants and pilgrims alike, a quiet belief took root. The Templars were not dead. They had merely gone underground, waiting for the world to be ready again. It was an idea too romantic, too mysterious to fade. The church had tried to erase the order's name, to burn their banners, melt their seals, and scrub their records. But the Templars had built something deeper than stone. They had built a story, one that couldn't be killed with fire or buried in royal decrees. And the story began to change shape. In the Middle Ages, people whispered that the Templars had discovered the Holy Grail beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple, that the treasure they carried was not gold, but knowledge, secret doctrines, ancient scrolls, perhaps even relics of Christ himself. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were expressions of longing for a lost wisdom, a purer faith, a world where the sacred and the powerful were one and the same. It's strange, isn't it? The church destroyed them for being too secretive, too independent, and yet that very secrecy made them immortal. The less we knew, the more we wondered, and wonder, as every myth-maker knows, is the soil in which legends grow. By the 14th century, the Templars were ghosts. By the 15th, they were saints of imagination. By the 18th, they had been reborn entirely, absorbed into the rituals of the Freemasons, who borrowed their symbols, their oaths, and their mystique. Masonic lodges across Europe adopted the Red Cross, the sword, and the language of brotherhood. In their dimly lit halls, among candles and geometry, men in powdered wigs whispered oaths not unlike those once spoken in Jerusalem. And in those flickering moments, the Templars lived again, not as soldiers, but as symbols. Symbols of resistance, of hidden knowledge, of purity lost and truth buried beneath the weight of time. Somewhere along the way, their story stopped being about history at all. It became about us, about our hunger for mystery, our suspicion of power, our desire to believe that somewhere in the forgotten corners of time, the pure and the brave are still watching. And that brings us back to that fateful Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, the day that superstition itself was born. Before that morning, Friday the 13th meant nothing. It was just a date. But after the Templars were seized, tried, and condemned, it became a symbol of betrayal and bad luck. The day the innocent were destroyed by the powerful. The day faith was tested and justice mocked. The day one of the most disciplined brotherhoods in human history was wiped out in a single breath. Centuries later, we still flinch at that date without remembering why. Maybe that's the real curse, not divine vengeance, but cultural memory, a faint echo of injustice that hums quietly beneath the surface of modern life. Every time the calendar aligns and Friday falls on the 13th, we pass through that echo. Most of us shrug it off, but somewhere deep in the collective mind, a voice whispers, "Be careful." It's the whisper of a fire crackling on an island in the Seine. The whisper of 9 knights kneeling in the dark, taking oaths no one else would ever hear. History loves to bury its ghosts, but ghosts, if nothing else, are patient, and so the legend of the Templars endures, not as a warning, not as dogma, but as a lullaby for the restless, a story that reminds us that even in corruption, there can be faith. Even in endings, there can be echoes. That the night, however dark, always remembers the shape of its stars. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sea, a cold wind blowing from the west, the smell of salt, iron, and rain. It's October of 1307, just days after the arrests began. France is tightening like a fist. Across the countryside, Templar commanderies, once bustling with horses, treasure, and prayer, now sit silent under royal seals. Soldiers ransack vaults, priests pore over ledgers, and the knights, those who survive the sudden sweep, vanish like smoke. Or at least, that's what history says. But if you listen carefully, beneath the crackle of parchment and the scratching of quills, you'll hear the ocean whispering another version. At the western edge of France, in the port of La Rochelle, witnesses claim they saw something strange. A convoy of ships flying the Red Cross of the Temple quietly slipped out to sea just before the arrests. The official records say nothing, but rumors say otherwise. Some say the ships were loaded with gold, silver, relics, and documents, everything the order held sacred. Others say they carried only men, brothers who refused to die in chains. Either way, when the king's men arrived to confiscate the Templar fleet, the docks were empty. Every ship was gone, vanished into the grey Atlantic mist. Where did they go? That question has haunted historians for centuries. Some claim they sailed north to Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the church, might have welcomed the outlawed knights. Scotland, after all, was in rebellion. Its land was cold, rugged, and far from papal reach. It's said that on the eve of Bannockburn in 1314, the same year Jacques de Molay was burned, a small band of armoured riders appeared on the battlefield, carrying the Red Cross. They turned the tide against the English, then disappeared as swiftly as they came. Is it true? Probably not. But as every good myth knows, plausibility is optional when the imagination takes hold. Others believe the Templars went west, farther than any Christian ship had gone, that they reached the shores of Portugal, and from there, the New World itself, centuries before Columbus. In Portugal, after all, the Templar legacy is easy to trace. King Denis, who admired the order's discipline and skill, quietly rebranded them as a new brotherhood, the Order of Christ. Same men, same property, same goals, different name. Under that new banner, they built fortresses, trained explorers, and financed voyages. Centuries later, one of their spiritual heirs, a man named Prince Henry the Navigator, would launch the Age of Exploration, and the Red Cross of the Templars would appear again, painted on the sails of caravels bound for Africa, India, and beyond. You've seen it before, even if you didn't notice it. The ships of Columbus, the sails of Vasco da Gama, the Red Cross fluttering against the wind. A silent inheritance, passed from the knights who once guarded pilgrims to the sailors who remapped the world. And so, some say, the Templars never truly vanished. They evolved. They traded swords for sextants and Jerusalem for the horizon. But there's another theory, quieter, stranger, almost tender in its melancholy, that many of the surviving Templars simply went home. Imagine them. Men in their 40s or 50s, scarred from years of crusade, watching everything they believed in collapse. Some fled across borders, shaving their beards, burning their mantles, blending back into ordinary life. A few became monks in other orders. A few became mercenaries fighting in wars for causes that meant less to them than the discipline itself. And some perhaps wandered until they disappeared entirely. It's easy to picture one, an old knight on a country road in Burgundy, walking beside a thin horse, whispering the prayers he'd once spoken in Latin under vaulted stone. The world had moved on, but his habits hadn't. He still woke before dawn. He still ate in silence. He still believed that somewhere, somehow, the temple would rise again. History doesn't record their names, but you can almost feel their absence, like a missing note in a song. Meanwhile, in the cities, the myth began to grow. People whispered that the knights had gone underground, forming secret brotherhoods that passed their wisdom down through generations. Some pointed to the Freemasons, whose ceremonies echoed Templar oaths of loyalty and secrecy. Others to the Rosicrucians, the mystics of the Renaissance who claimed to guard ancient knowledge. And later still, to shadowy organizations whispered about in smoky taverns, societies of men who spoke in symbols, who wore rings marked with crosses, and who always seemed to know more than they should. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. What mattered was that the idea felt true, because deep down, humanity hates endings. We don't like to believe that things simply stop, that great movements vanish overnight. We'd rather imagine that somewhere, beneath the surface, the story continues. And maybe it does. In Scotland, legends grew of hidden lodges beneath cathedrals, where descendants of the Templars met by candlelight. In Spain and Portugal, old families claimed to possess relics from the temple, swords, seals, and parchments that no historian could trace. and in France the ghost stories began. Peasants said that on stormy nights they saw riders in white cloaks galloping through the woods near old commanderies, their torches flickering like stars. No hoofbeats, no voices, just the wind, the rain, and the sound of metal brushing against metal. The church called it superstition, but the peasants knew better. They said it was the Templars, still keeping watch. Centuries later, during the French Revolution, when mobs looted churches and burned archives, strange things were found. Stone carvings of Templar crosses hidden behind altars, letters sealed with wax bearing the order's symbol, and cryptic diagrams suggesting that not everything had been destroyed. Even Napoleon, the great skeptic, was rumored to have been fascinated by them. When he invaded Egypt in 1798, he brought with him not just soldiers, but scholars, engineers, and, oddly enough, men obsessed with the Templar myth. They saw the pyramids, the ruins of ancient Alexandria, and believed they were walking in the same footsteps as those mysterious knights who had once dug beneath Solomon's temple. It was as if every century rediscovered the Templars anew, each generation projecting its own dreams onto their ghost. For the Renaissance, they were seekers of hidden wisdom. For the Enlightenment, martyrs of superstition. For the modern age, symbols of rebellion against authority. And through it all, their image never changed. White cloaks, red crosses, silent resolve. The perfect blend of purity and menace. That's the strange paradox of the Knights Templar. They began as humble monks sworn to poverty and ended as eternal figures of power. They were meant to defend faith but became symbols of doubt. They were destroyed for secrecy, and yet secrecy is what keeps them alive. When you trace their story from the ruins of Jerusalem to the myths of modernity, you realize that the Templars have become less a chapter of history and more a kind of mirror. Every age sees itself in them. Every conspiracy, every spiritual revival, every lost cause finds its reflection in their legend. Even today, their name is everywhere. Video games, novels, films, coffee brands, even insurance companies. The irony would probably amuse them. Men who once vowed to own nothing now sell everything. But perhaps that's fitting. The Templars were never just about religion or war. They were about the human need to believe in something that endures. And maybe that's why we can't stop imagining where they went. Not because we need the facts, but because we need the comfort of knowing that ideals, courage, loyalty, sacrifice, don't just die with men. They drift, they adapt, they survive. So when you think of those ships sailing out of La Rochelle into the fog, try not to see them as fugitives. See them as dreamers, as the embodiment of a simple, quiet truth. That faith and mystery always find a way to escape the fire. Maybe they reached Scotland, maybe they reached the New World, or maybe they're still out there somewhere, beyond the horizon, sailing a sea that never ends. Imagine a cold dawn in Paris, 1307. The streets smell of smoke and fear. Bells toll somewhere in the distance, slow, heavy, deliberate. The king's guards march through the mist, their armor clattering like a death knell. Inside the stone halls of the royal fortress, a handful of exhausted men kneel before a tribunal. Their white mantles, once symbols of divine purpose, are now stained with dirt and tears. The red cross across their chests looks almost like a wound. These are the Knights Templar, the once unbreakable brotherhood now accused of heresy, blasphemy, and witchcraft. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, stands among them. His face is gaunt, his hands tremble, but not from fear, from disbelief. Only a few years earlier, kings had begged for the Templars' loans, popes had blessed their missions, and merchants had trusted their vaults. vaults with fortunes. And now, the same powers that exalted them call them servants of the devil. Let's be clear, the charges were absurd. The Templars were accused of spitting on the cross during secret initiations, of worshipping a mysterious idol named Baphomet, a bearded head that supposedly whispered prophecies, of kissing each other's backsides as oaths of loyalty. It sounds like something invented by a drunk gossip trying to impress a tavern full of bored clerks. But in medieval Europe, rumor and heresy were as lethal as swords. Under torture, men confessed to anything. And King Philip IV of France, buried in debt to the Templars, knew that pain was cheaper than repayment. He wanted their treasure and their silence. So he ordered confession after confession until even the strongest broke. It's strange to imagine these were men trained to endure battle, to ride through sieges, to fight without sleep. And yet here they were, chained in dungeons, whispering prayers that turned into pleas. Some recanted immediately, others held firm until their bodies gave out. But through it all, one question pulsed beneath the surface like a heartbeat. Where is the treasure? Because according to legend, the Templars had amassed unimaginable wealth. Gold from Jerusalem, silver from Europe, relics from the Holy Land. They were bankers to kings, landlords to half of France, and custodians of secrets no one dared write down. When their order collapsed, that treasure simply disappeared. The official records show nothing. The king found empty vaults, the church seized estates, but no gold. And so the myth began. The missing Templar treasure has been called the most enduring unsolved mystery in medieval history. Over the centuries it's been found 1,000 times, in hidden tunnels under Paris, buried beneath Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, locked inside the catacombs of Malta, even frozen beneath Nova Scotia's Oak Island, where fortune hunters have been digging for 200 years and still haven't hit bottom. Each theory begins the same way, with the night of October 13th, 1307, when those ships at La Rochelle sailed off into the mist. And each theory ends the same way, with an empty map and more questions. But maybe the treasure wasn't gold at all. Maybe what they protected wasn't wealth, but knowledge. There's a quiet rumor, older than the Freemasons, older than most conspiracy theories, that the Templars discovered something beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple during their early years in Jerusalem. What it was, no one agrees on. Some say it was the Holy Grail, not a cup, but a secret bloodline. Others claim it was the Ark of the Covenant, still humming with divine energy. And a few whisper that it was something far less biblical, ancient texts from before recorded history, knowledge so profound it could rewrite theology itself. Whatever it was, the rumor insists that the Templars hid it, not in one place, but in many. Fragments scattered like seeds across Europe, buried under chapels, sealed in crypts, or disguised as relics. You can almost imagine it. Stone corridors lit by flickering torches, brothers moving in silence, passing relics wrapped in linen. No words spoken, no records written, only vows that what was found in the Holy Land must never be lost again. It's beautiful, isn't it? The idea that knowledge can be smuggled through time, that truth, like treasure, can survive corruption, fire, and forgetfulness. But let's pause, because the historian's mind has a way of ruining poetry. The truth is, most of what the Templars had was painfully ordinary. Farms, mills, vineyards, warehouses. Their treasure was bookkeeping. Still, the legend persists, because it speaks to something deeper, a yearning for meaning behind mystery. We want to believe that somewhere beneath the dust, something sacred still waits to be uncovered, and maybe, in a way, it does. Because even stripped of myth, The story of the Templar trials is a perfect reflection of how power consumes its own creation. King Philip's campaign wasn't just about greed, it was about fear, the kind that festers when kings realize faith answers to no one. The Templars had grown too independent. Their wealth was international. Their loyalty was to God, not to any throne. They were an early version of globalization, efficient, disciplined, untaxed. They'd become everything monarchs hate, powerful, moral, and incorruptible. And so Philip did what tyrants always do when faced with something they can't control. He called it evil. By 1310, the trials had become theater. Dozens of knights were paraded through Paris to confess and repent before crowds. Some, desperate for mercy, repeated the false confessions they'd made under torture. Others refused, and for that they were burned. The flames were said to burn clean. No black smoke, only white. People whispered it was the Holy Spirit taking their souls. Others said it was the wind carrying away the last truth the church dared not hear. But one man's death would outlive them all. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master. In 1314, after 7 years of imprisonment, he was led to a small island on the Seine. The executioner tied him to the stake as the king's men watched. When asked for a final confession, de Molay refused. He looked at the crowd and spoke instead to the heavens. He declared that both the king and the pope, Philip and Clement, would soon answer before God for what they had done. It was less a curse than a statement of cosmic bookkeeping, but it landed like a thunderclap. Within a year, both men were dead, and so legend turned to prophecy. The curse of Jacques de Molay was born. In taverns, people whispered that the Templars had struck back from beyond the grave, that the king's line was doomed, and when Philip's dynasty collapsed within a few generations, the myth grew stronger. History remembers it as coincidence, but myth doesn't care for coincidence. It prefers poetry, and in that poetry, the Templars became immortal. Their treasure, whatever it was, became eternal. Their curse became their revenge. You can see echoes of it everywhere, in novels about secret codes and grail quests, in stories of lost bloodlines and hidden orders, in the fascination that still surrounds their name. Because deep down, the story of the Templars isn't just about power or faith. It's about loss. The loss of certainty, of purity, of something once believed to be incorruptible. And perhaps that's why it still hums beneath our collective imagination, because when we stare into history long enough, we start to see ourselves. The way faith becomes ambition, ambition becomes greed, and greed becomes legend. So maybe the real Templar treasure isn't buried in stone or sealed in vaults. Maybe it's the myth itself, the part of human nature that refuses to stop believing, even when reason tells it to. The belief that something holy might still be hidden under all this noise and dust, that even in ruin there's a secret worth protecting, and somewhere, under moonlight or memory, a ship still drifts through fog, carrying not gold, but the weight of a promise, the promise that no truth ever really disappears. It just waits to be rediscovered. Picture this, the flames dying down on that island in the Seine, the crowd dispersing into the night, their faces glowing with the reflected orange of what they'd just witnessed. And above it all, the black smoke curling toward the spires of Paris, drifting into legend. Jacques de Molay was dead, but his curse, if you believe in such things, had already taken root. The chroniclers of the time, even the cautious ones, couldn't ignore what happened next. Within months, Pope Clement V was dead of illness. Within a year, King Philip IV was thrown from his horse and died suddenly. No heirs, no fortune, no redemption. It was as if the fire had leapt from de Molay's pyre into the royal bloodline itself. Whispered superstition turned to conviction. The Templars had called down divine justice. And that's where history ends and myth truly begins, because after that day the Knights Templar ceased to exist in the record. Their castles were seized, their lands divided, their members absorbed into other orders or driven into hiding. But their name, their symbol, only grew stronger. You can destroy a building, you can hang a man, but you can't kill an idea that has already become a myth. Let's be honest, the world loves a good mystery wrapped in moral ambiguity. The Templars were the perfect storm, part saint, part sinner, disciplined yet secretive, blessed yet cursed. And so, century after century, their shadow kept resurfacing in new disguises. In medieval Germany, people whispered that the Templars had gone underground, literally tunneling beneath mountains to guard their hidden treasure. In Scotland, they were said to have joined Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn, their white mantles glowing like ghosts as they charged across the misty fields. In Portugal, they supposedly rebranded as the Order of Christ, quietly sailing under new banners as Europe's age of exploration began. Everywhere they vanished, stories bloomed like ivy over old stone. By the Renaissance, artists painted them into allegories. By the Enlightenment, philosophers invoked them as symbols of reason suppressed by superstition. By the 18th century, they'd re-emerged again, this time whispered to be the ancestors of the Freemasons, the supposed keepers of ancient wisdom and architects of secret societies that shaped revolutions and empires alike. No proof, of course, but when has lack of proof ever stopped a good story? And then came the 19th century, a perfect breeding ground for myth. Romantics were obsessed with lost causes, fallen knights, and tragic purity. The Templars became literary gold. Poets wrote of their courage, novelists embroidered their rituals, and painters gave them halos of melancholy light. They became a mirror for every generation's anxieties. The pure few against the corrupt many, the dream of spiritual order in a chaotic world. And that's the secret ingredient to their immortality. Each age reshapes them to fit its own fears and fantasies. For the Victorians, they were noble martyrs. For the mystics, guardians of sacred geometry and alchemical truth. For the modern internet, they're either ancient aliens or early bankers. The spectrum runs from the sublime to the ridiculous, and somehow the Knights Templar fit perfectly into both. But why? Why them and not some other crusading order lost to time? Maybe it's because they sit right on the fault line between faith and doubt. They were monks with swords, believers who killed, poor men who became rich, holy men who served kings. Their contradictions make them endlessly recyclable, adaptable to whatever mystery you want them to represent. And let's be clear, people love contradictions. They feel human, they feel possible. The Templars are not gods or demons. They're a reflection of how ambition twists faith, how purity curdles into power, and how power always inevitably invites its own destruction. It's almost poetic that they were accused of worshipping a severed head, because in a way, that's what their legend became, a body without a leader, kept alive by imagination, headless but somehow still breathing. Let's drift for a moment to one of those places still whispered about, Rosslyn Chapel, Scotland. Built in the 1400s, long after the Templars' supposed end, it's a riot of stone carvings, angels, vines, strange geometric knots, and figures that seem oddly ancient. In the quiet of that chapel, with dust in the sunlight, and the faint echo of distant hymns, you can almost believe the stories, that beneath its floor lies a vault, and in that vault lies a secret, one so profound it could change everything we know about history. But then again, maybe it's just a crypt, maybe it's just stone and shadow, and maybe that's the point, that the real magic of the Templars isn't what they left behind, but what we keep searching for. Even their curse, that famous curse of de Molay, wasn't a curse at all until later writers made it one. It was a final speech, a cry for divine justice, but humans can't resist dramatizing justice into vengeance. We want the universe to mean something, to balance the scales, so we turn dying words into cosmic verdicts, and over time, that became the mythology we know today. Friday the 13th, the day of the arrests, turned into a symbol of bad luck. Their crosses became icons of mystery. Their disappearance became proof of survival. It's all absurd, and yet strangely comforting, because buried within the fantasy is a wish that truth survives corruption, that goodness hides rather than dies, that somewhere there's still a secret order of noble souls keeping the flame alive in a world that's long gone dark. And who knows, maybe that's true, not in the literal sense, but in the sense that stories are secret orders. Each retelling keeps the memory alive. Each listener becomes an initiate, one more person who knows that once there were men who tried to turn faith into action and paid the price. So when you hear their name, the Knights Templar, maybe don't imagine treasure or curses or cryptic symbols. Imagine something quieter, a group of men kneeling under torchlight, making promises they could never keep but tried to anyway. Imagine their breath clouding in the cold air, their armor cold against their skin, their hearts probably as uncertain as yours or mine. And perhaps in that uncertainty lies their true immortality, because we don't remember them as saints or villains. We remember them as the dream that somewhere in the chaos of history, people once believed they could create something pure, something incorruptible, something worth dying for. And though their towers have fallen and their banners turned to dust, the idea still flickers in stone carvings, in folk tales, in the glow of every conspiracy theory forum at 3 a.m. The Templars endure not because they were flawless, but because they were human. And humans have always dreamed of perfection, even as we fall short of it. So when you finally close your eyes tonight, imagine the world they left behind. Imagine the quiet after the fire, the soft sound of waves against forgotten shores. Somewhere a candle burns low, somewhere an oath is whispered again, and somewhere in the deep rhythm of history, the order still rides, not in armor, but in memory, because the truth is, nothing truly holy ever dies. It simply changes shape and waits to be remembered. So now we reach the end, or rather, the echo. The story of the Knights Templar doesn't really end. It simply fades like candlelight in a long corridor, stretching further and further into shadow. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, through crusades and curses, through deserts and dungeons, take a moment to notice the quiet. The world they built and the world they lost are both long gone, but the silence they left behind still hums with meaning. Imagine it, Europe asleep under frost, old cathedrals creaking with age, the moonlight brushing against statues of long-forgotten knights. In that stillness, you can almost hear them, the faint clink of armor, the whisper of prayer, the soft murmur of devotion and doubt braided together. because that's what the Templars really were. Not gods, not monsters, just men standing at the fragile intersection between the sacred and the human. They tried to build heaven with earthly tools, swords, stone, oaths, and hope. And like everyone who's ever reached too high, they fell. But falling doesn't mean failure. It just means the dream became too heavy for the age that held it. History loves to paint the Templars as symbols of greed, of purity, of secrets, of sin. But perhaps they were simply mirrors, reflecting what every civilization fears most. That no matter how powerful we become, or how righteous we think we are, time will eventually unmake us, fold us back into silence. And yet, the beauty is that silence isn't nothing. It's the space where memory lives, it's where myths breathe, and it's where you, right now, can find peace. As you drift, think of how strange it is that the same stones that witnessed their vows now lie beneath traffic, beneath cities, beneath centuries of dust. But if you look closely, the pattern is still there, in church floor tiles, in the geometry of modern skylines, in the lingering idea that faith, when coupled with discipline, can move empires. Every age finds its Templars, not in armor, but in conviction, not guarding pilgrims, but guarding truth, or art, or compassion, or whatever fragile thing seems worth defending in their time. Maybe you've been one of them without realizing it, someone trying to build something pure in a world that doesn't always reward purity. So tonight, as the story fades, let the noise of history recede behind you. The clash of swords, the whispers of betrayal, the long sermons and louder silences. Let them dissolve into the steady rhythm of your breath, because this is what remains when the myths fall quiet. A reminder that even the grandest empires, the greatest orders, and the most secret brotherhoods eventually return to stillness. And in that stillness, something eternal stirs, not banners, not blood, but the simple, persistent urge to remember that once humans dreamed of divine perfection, that they believed in sacred duty, that they tried, however imperfectly, to bridge the distance between heaven and earth. And maybe that's enough. If you close your eyes now, you might see them one last time, riding slowly into the horizon, the sun setting behind them, their white mantles glowing faintly in the fading light. No words, no music, just the sound of hooves in the sand, steady as a heartbeat. And then, quiet, the kind of quiet that carries centuries. So let the world of the Templars drift away. The wars, the treasures, the secrets, what's left is only peace, soft, steady, endless peace. Thank you for joining this journey through time, for wandering through cathedrals, deserts, and dreams. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more journeys through history to help you sleep, please subscribe. And before you drift off completely, tell me what's keeping you up tonight. Maybe next time we'll dream through that too. For now, rest easy. You're safe. History will keep its secrets until morning. Good night.